The silence comes first. Not the gentle kind, but the kind that hums thick, electric, waiting to break. Then comes the smell, carbolic acid, ether, and blood. A hospital at midnight. A tomb that pretends to heal. Somewhere beyond the curtain, a man is praying through his teeth. Another one is laughing in his sleep, the kind of laughter that doesn't sound human anymore. Footsteps echo down the ward, followed by the metallic whisper of a syringe being filled. Morphine drips through the night, like a promise. Each drop lands with the weight of forgiveness and the shadow of something that will not let go. It is the late Victorian age, an empire proud and poisoned, shining on the surface, rotting underneath. The same surgeons who saved lives now measure comfort by the grain. The same hands that held rifles now tremble for the needle. In the barracks and hospital wards, they call it the soldier's friend, a white powder that turns agony into sleep, and sleep into hunger. They said it was mercy. They said it was a miracle. But mercy has teeth, and miracles don't bleed. Morphine waits in the veins, whispering like a ghost that remembers every wound. So tonight, keep the light low and listen to the silence between heartbeats, because this is where it began, the Morphine Curse, when the empire's wounded found peace in a needle and never truly woke again. Subscribe and stay with me. There are more ghosts to uncover, more histories to haunt, and more nights that never end. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? The past is never as far away as you think. The wind across the Crimean plateau carried the smell of iron and smoke. Beneath it, the groans of men mingled with the snapping of canvas and the distant roll of cannon fire, now fading into the hills. The battlefield had gone quiet, but not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that came after thunder, heavy, unnatural, filled with the weight of what could still be heard in memory. Stretchers moved like ghosts through the mud, their bearers wading through pools of blood turned black in the cold. Inside the field hospital, the lamps sputtered against the wind. Shadows of surgeons bent low over crude wooden tables, sleeves rolled to the elbow, faces pale with exhaustion. The walls were streaked with handprints, not all of them living. A young doctor, his moustache wet with sweat, reached for a vial marked morphium. His fingers shook, not from fear, but from the promise that this new powder might stop the screaming that had haunted every corner of this tent since dawn. Until now, pain had been a constant companion in war, a living thing that clung to soldiers as fiercely as their enemies did. Ether was unpredictable, chloroform dangerous. But this was something different. They called it the miracle of the age, a crystalline compound born from the dark heart of opium, refined in the laboratories of Germany and carried across Europe, like salvation in glass. Dissolved and injected with a hollow needle, it calmed the body so swiftly it seemed to still the soul itself. "Hold him steady," the doctor murmured, as an orderly pinned a soldier's shoulders. The man's leg was a mangled ruin of bone and cloth. His breath came in short, animal gasps. The syringe slipped beneath the skin, and for the first time in hours, silence fell. The soldier's face relaxed, his jaw unclenched. His eyes, once wide with terror, softened, then drifted into something like peace. Around him, the tent seemed to exhale. By the end of the hour, word had spread among the wounded. There was a new kind of mercy here. Men begged not for water, not for a priest, but for the white drop, as they called it. Doctors moved from cot to cot, their hands now sure, their own fear dulled by the miracle they'd found. It was as if they had discovered a way to erase suffering itself. The field hospital no longer sounded like hell, it sounded like sleep. Outside, the night grew colder. The stars above the battlefield burned faintly through the haze, indifferent witnesses to what was being borne below. Among the dead and dying, the Empire had found its newest weapon not against the enemy, but against agony itself. The doctors could not yet know that they had also unleashed something that would follow these soldiers home, creeping into the quiet of their parlors and bedrooms, into the trembling of their hands, For now, they called it mercy. Later, they would call it by another name. The morphine curse had begun. In a narrow German laboratory filled with glass and gaslight, the air shimmered with a faint sweetness, the scent of distillation. Bottles lined the walls like a congregation, each labeled with Latin names that only the initiated could read. Here, in the quiet hum of the early 19th century, a young chemist named Friedrich Saturner stared into a flask of milky solution. For weeks he had been isolating the essence of the poppy, the ancient flower of both healing and ruin. He sought to capture not its fragrance, but its power. Opium had long been Europe's faithful sedative. Doctors prescribed it for everything from headaches to heartbreak, from battlefield wounds to restless infants. But it was crude, unpredictable, a devil's mixture of comfort and chaos. Saturner dreamed of something purer, something divine. He filtered, evaporated, and prayed, until one morning he awoke to find white crystals clinging to the inside of his vessel like frost. He tasted them on the tip of his tongue and felt the world slip softly away. He named his discovery morphium, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. It seemed a fitting tribute, a substance that could summon sleep, still pain, and silence the cries of the dying. In his notes, Saturner wrote with reverence, almost piety. He believed he had found a blessing. He did not yet know that he had given the world a new kind of chain, invisible, chemical, and absolute. News of the discovery spread quietly through Europe's medical circles. Pharmacists sent letters of astonishment. Physicians ordered samples for study. The journals called it a triumph of science over suffering. By the 1820s, every hospital in Berlin, Vienna, and London had heard whispers of this new miracle alkaloid. Doctors administered it with awe, watching fevers subside and convulsions still. The dying smiled again before slipping away. Soon, morphine was everywhere, bottled in chemists' windows beside chloroform and quinine, each label written in careful calligraphy, a promise in ink. Apothecaries spoke of it with the same reverence priests gave to relics. For the first time in human memory, pain could be switched off like a lantern. The Victorian mind, obsessed with mastery and control, embraced it completely. But even miracles demand faith, and faith can blind. Behind the glowing praise of medical journals lay quiet notes of unease. Patients appear tranquil, one German physician wrote, but upon waking, they request another dose. Another reported, the body adapts swiftly, the will less so. These were small warnings, easily ignored in the flood of progress. The 19th century was not an age of hesitation. It was an age of invention, of empires built on chemistry, steel, and belief. As the decades turned, morphine crossed borders the way faith once had carried by travelers, soldiers, and doctors who believed they were bringing light. It was mixed into tonics, tinctures, and patent remedies, its presence cloaked beneath fancy names. It was both medicine and mystery, both salvation and temptation. In the glow of the laboratory lamp, Saturner might have seen it than the ghost of what he'd created. The crystals glittered like snow in the flask, beautiful and pure. But purity, as the Victorians would learn, could be its own form of poison. The miracle had been born. The curse was only waiting to be named. It began as a whisper in the medical halls of London, Paris, and Vienna, a new instrument that could deliver salvation not by mouth, but by precision. The hypodermic syringe, a hollow needle, slender as a quill and just as sharp, attached to a glass barrel that shimmered under the lamplight. Doctors spoke of it as if it were divine, a conduit through which pain itself could be banished in seconds. The newspapers called it the triumph of the age. Before its invention, morphine was swallowed, diluted in alcohol or syrup, forced to meander through the body before its relief arrived. But the needle changed everything. With a single push of the thumb, doctors could send the miracle directly into the blood. Swift, clean, near instant. It was not just medicine anymore. It was power. The power to silence screams, to ease the dying, to bring sleep where there had been only torment. To Victorian minds obsessed with control and order, it was perfection itself. The first patients marveled. Pain that had once felt like fire was extinguished in moments. Amputees, soldiers, and invalids alike felt a kind of grace descend through their veins. "It is as though the body forgets it is broken," one physician wrote after injecting a wounded officer. The man, moments before delirious with agony, now smiled faintly and whispered, "I can rest." And rest he did, unmoving, untroubled, pale beneath the linen sheets. Soon, the syringe became a symbol of modern medicine. Physicians carried them in leather cases beside their stethoscopes. Wealthy patients ordered them privately, fitted with silver caps and ivory plungers. Each gleaming needle carried the promise of mercy and the shadow of dependence. But the Victorians, in their faith in progress, saw only the promise. They believed suffering had met its match. Yet something unsettling followed in the needle's wake. The relief it offered was too pure, too immediate. The body remembered it. The mind began to crave it. Those who had been given injections after surgeries or amputations would, weeks later, complain of phantom pains, insisting that the agony had returned, but it was not pain they sought to cure. It was the absence of it they longed to feel again. Doctors obliged, believing repetition harmless. A habit of relief, they called it, with a smile. In drawing rooms and military wards alike, the syringe became a quiet companion. Officers who had faced cannon fire now feared a night without their injection. Housewives prescribed morphine for hysteria learned to keep a vial in their vanity drawer. There was no social class immune to its charm. Morphine did not discriminate, only dissolve. By mid-century, the line between cure and craving had blurred to invisibility. The doctors who celebrated the syringe as the pinnacle of medical precision had unknowingly built the perfect prison one with glass walls and silver gates. Inside, the patient did not scream. Inside, there was no war, no heartbreak, no grief, only the stillness of forgetfulness. But silence, as the Victorians would soon discover, has a cost, and once the needle taught the body to forget pain, it also taught it to forget how to live without it. The operating theatre of mid-Victorian London was a strange cathedral. Light fell in pale shafts through high glass windows, illuminating tiled floors scrubbed until they gleamed like bone. The air smelled of carbolic acid, sweat, and something else, something metallic and unmistakable. Blood. Rows of students watched from the gallery, their notebooks poised, as the surgeon below raised his hands to the light, like a priest preparing for communion. The object of worship lay before him, not the patient, but the syringe. By the 1850s, surgery had become spectacle. Men of science were heroes, now cleaner than soldiers, cleverer than priests. Their tools were instruments of precision, and morphine was the most sacred among them. It gave them mastery over the human body, the ability to cut, saw, and stitch without the interruption of screams. For centuries, pain had been an unavoidable part of healing the body's protest, a warning that life still clung to the flesh. But now, with a few grains of powder and a steady hand, pain could be silenced completely. It was not simply medicine, it was dominion. Dr. Henry Wakeman, a surgeon at St. Bartholomew's, was among those who believed he stood at the threshold of a new age. He wrote proudly in his journal that morphine allowed him to operate with divine confidence. No longer did he fear the trembling of a patient or the curse of consciousness. He injected, he cut, he stitched, and the men beneath his knife did not stir. To him, it was progress incarnate, the triumph of intellect over suffering. He began to speak of his work as miracle craft. But with every miracle, there came a shadow. In the quiet wards after the operations, the nurses noticed strange patterns. Men who had survived their surgeries began to tremble days later, begging for the white draft again. They could not sleep, could not eat, their eyes sunken with longing. Wakeman dismissed it as nervous reaction. Others called it weakness, moral frailty. But the nurses, who washed their sheets and wiped their brows, knew the truth. These men were not ill, they were haunted. Still, the surgeons pressed on. The more they injected, the more they believed themselves infallible. The operating theatre became their pulpit, the syringe, their staff of office. Pain was no longer a teacher but an inconvenience, something to be eliminated, not understood. They spoke in Latin, wore spotless gloves, and signed their names with flourishes that looked like blessings. Some began experimenting with self-injection to better understand the patient's experience. Within months, several of these same men were whispering for privacy before their morning rounds, their hands shaking until they found relief from their own creation. Outside the hospitals, the world worshipped them. Newspapers wrote of the doctors who conquered agony. Women sent letters begging for treatment. Soldiers wrote testimonials praising their skill. They were no longer merely healers, they were arbiters of comfort, lords of silence, and the silence was spreading. The syringe, once a servant, had become a throne. Beneath its gleaming surface, both doctor and patient were learning the same lesson, that mercy, when unrestrained, can become its own form of cruelty. In the flicker of the gaslight, Dr. Wakeman recorded his final note of the evening, "Morphine, the hand of God." Then he leaned back, closed his eyes, and reached for the vial himself. Far from the drawing rooms of London, the true theatre of morphine's power was unfolding in a place that smelled of salt, smoke, and death. Scutari, the British military hospital on the Asian shore of the Bosphorus, stood like a fortress of misery. It was 1854, and the Crimean War had torn Europe open. Inside the great stone building, the corridors echoed with the sound of boots, groans, and distant gunfire carried by the wind across the sea. The wounded came in waves, unloaded from hospital ships that reeked of iron and rot. And with each new arrival, the same question followed. Is there any morphine left? Florence Nightingale, moving like a ghost through the dim wards with her lamp, had long since stopped counting the dead. Her nurses were exhausted, their hands cracked from cold and carbolic, their aprons stained a permanent brown. They worked without rest, washing wounds, changing bandages, wiping blood from the mouths of men too weak to speak. The doctors, though grateful for their aid, kept their most precious tool under lock and key, a small chest of vials marked with neat black letters, morphium hydrochlor. Each vial was guarded like treasure. In the early days, only the worst cases received injections, men screaming with shattered limbs, men who had lost faces, hands, or hope. One by one they were stilled, their cries softening to sighs, then to sleep. "Blessed relief," wrote one nurse in her journal, "but God help them when it wears off." For in the days that followed, these same men would wake trembling, begging for more, eyes wide as if hunted by something unseen. Florence herself was wary of the drug. She believed in discipline, in the moral strength of endurance, yet even she could not deny its mercy. She ordered the doctors to administer morphine sparingly, only in cases where prayer and patience have failed. But war laughs at restraint. Within months, the supply lines ran thin, and new batches were shipped across seas alongside ammunition and letters from home. Morphine had become as vital as bullets. At night, the wards grew unnaturally still. Rows of bandaged soldiers lay in their cots, their breathing shallow, their dreams heavy. A few murmured fragments of home, the name of a wife, a child, a street they would never see again. To walk among them was to walk among the dead and the half-dead. The gas lamps flickered over faces smooth with unnatural peace. The nurses whispered that morphine had given them the quiet death, a gentler passage than the surgeon's saw or the fever's fire. But not all who slept would die. Some would awaken, weeks later, changed, their bodies healed, but their spirits chained. In letters sent home to England, they spoke of strange cravings, of sleepless nights without the needle, of pain that returned not to the body but to the mind. "I am well," one soldier wrote to his mother, "but I am not myself." When the war finally ended, thousands sailed home to a country that called them heroes. Yet in the dark, many still reached for the memory of that quiet peace beneath the hospital lamps. The war had left them their lives but taken their freedom. The morphine they carried in their veins was no longer medicine. It was memory, mercy, and curse, a ghost that would follow them home. The steamship Himalaya groaned against the current as it left the Black Sea, its decks crowded with men who had survived what others had not. The war was over, but none of them looked victorious. Their uniforms were stiff with salt and bandages. Their eyes had the still, hollow sheen of those who had stared too long at suffering. The morphine that had saved them in Scutari now lay packed in small brown bottles inside the ship's infirmary. It was meant for emergencies, though the men soon discovered that the ache of the soul could be just as unbearable as a bullet wound. When they reached Portsmouth, the air was cold and familiar. Women waited on the docks with children pressed against their skirts, cheering, crying, waving handkerchiefs. But the soldiers stepped ashore, with the quiet of men walking through a dream. Their families saw it first, the strange calm, the way they flinched at the clang of iron, the way they sat for hours staring at nothing. They did not speak of morphine, because it was medicine, not sin. Yet when the pain of the journey home returned the phantom limb that burned, the night terrors that clawed, they wrote letters to the military hospitals asking if more could be sent. The letters were polite at first, written in neat, cursive, with military precision. "Sir, I humbly request a small further supply of the powder that eased my recovery." But as the weeks turned to months, the handwriting grew erratic, the tone more desperate. "I cannot sleep. The wound burns, though it is long closed. I have taken laudanum and gin to no avail." Others enclosed coins or small gifts, hoping to coax a sympathetic apothecary. The requests were rarely denied. After all, these were heroes of empire, men who had bled for the Queen. In parlours across Britain, families rejoiced that their sons had returned. But when night fell, the morphine ritual began. A wife would fetch the case from the mantel and draw the curtains. The husband, shaking with a pain he could not name, would roll up his sleeve and sigh as the needle found its mark. The transformation was immediate, jaw unclenched, breath slowed, eyes glazed. "He sleeps," the wife would whisper. "At last he sleeps." She did not see that sleep was the new battle he could never win. Doctors encouraged the use. They called it maintenance, not dependence. One described it as the soldier's reprieve. Another wrote, "If a man may live in comfort with a few daily grains, who are we to deny him?" No one yet spoke the word addiction. It had not entered the polite vocabulary of medicine. Pain, after all, was still the greater enemy. In the years that followed, morphine began appearing in post-war memoirs as a quiet companion, a detail tucked between accounts of bravery and loss. "The nights are easier now," wrote Captain Thomas Rayner in his diary, "though I find the mornings grow longer." He died in his sleep the following winter, the empty syringe still clutched in his hand. Across the empire, more letters continued to arrive from Ireland, from India, from the far colonies, each written in the same steady desperation. "Send more of the white medicine. The pain has returned." But it was not pain that haunted them now. It was absence, the unbearable silence that followed the touch of morphine, the ghostly calm that no amount of living could ever replace. They had survived the battlefield, but not the mercy that followed. The war had ended, yet in their blood it went on. The apothecaries of Victorian London were temples of order, polished mahogany counters, shelves lined with bottles in perfect symmetry, and the gentle clink of glass that sounded almost like prayer. Inside, behind the gleam of civility, medicine was becoming alchemy. A new clientele had begun to appear. Not only soldiers and invalids, but women in silk gloves, men in fine coats, and servants clutching folded notes from their masters. Each asked for the same thing in different words: the white powder, the German salt, or simply relief. The chemists smiled, nodded, and turned to the back room where the drawers were marked morphium. Morphine had crossed the threshold from battlefield to boulevard with remarkable ease. Once reserved for the dying, it was now prescribed for sleeplessness, for nervous exhaustion, for grief. A widow might receive it for her tears, a clerk for his trembling hands, a child for his fever. Doctors scribbled prescriptions with the confidence of men who believed progress had no price, and the apothecaries obliged, their scales delicate enough to measure sin in grains. The men who ran these shops understood their trade better than most physicians. They knew who returned too often, who trembled when they reached for the counter, who lingered to ask when the next shipment might arrive from Hamburg or Bombay. They knew which ladies ordered in secrecy, which soldiers bought more than they could afford. They were not cruel men, only practical ones. Profit is a quiet persuader. The more morphine they sold, the more their shops prospered. They justified it with the same phrase whispered in every back room: if the doctors prescribe it, who are we to deny it? The city outside was sick in its own way. The air was thick with soot, the Thames ran black, and the streets swarmed with beggars, prostitutes, and coughing factory workers. Pain was everywhere, physical, emotional, moral, and the Victorians, with their obsession for composure, sought to suppress it all. Morphine offered exactly what their world demanded: calmness, cleanliness, control. It was the chemical embodiment of restraint, a drop under the tongue or a quiet prick of the syringe, and one could face the day again, polished and composed. By the 1860s, entire neighborhoods had fallen under the spell of the apothecary's charm. In Bloomsbury and Mayfair, genteel families kept small bottles of morphine alongside their cologne. In Whitechapel, the poor bought diluted forms from unlicensed chemists who mixed the powder with gin or laudanum. The rich drifted off in silken bedrooms, the poor in back alley rooms lit by gaslight. The drug was democratic in its cruelty, it spared no class distinction. Some apothecaries grew uneasy. One, a man named Joseph Tilby of Fleet Street, wrote in his ledger beside certain names a single mark, a small black cross. It meant too often a silent acknowledgement of something unspoken. Years later, when investigators searched his books, those marks told a different story. A quiet epidemic moving beneath the pulse of London, hidden behind polite commerce. But no law forbade it. No sermon condemned it. Morphine was still considered virtue, bottled science's answer to the chaos of human suffering. And so the apothecaries continued to measure out their miracles, grain by grain, each sale another step in the slow undoing of the city's soul. Behind every respectable counter, the same secret persisted. London was not healing. It was learning how to suffer beautifully. In every respectable Victorian home, there was a sewing table. It was a symbol of order, of quiet diligence, of womanly grace. Lace, ribbons, and silk threads spilled from its drawers like delicate entrails of domestic virtue, and tucked among the thimbles and scissors, unseen by visitors, there was often something else. A small velvet pouch, holding a polished syringe and a vial of morphine. She was not a sinner, nor a criminal, nor even what the newspapers would one day call an addict. She was a lady, a wife, a mother, a daughter of good family, and she had been prescribed the medicine by a doctor who wore a monocle and spoke softly of nerves. The diagnosis was as vague as the cure was precise: a touch of melancholy, a spell of sleeplessness, the strain of the season. For such ailments, morphine was perfect, discreet, effective, and above all, respectable. The first dose came with ceremony. The doctor demonstrated how to mix the crystals, how to draw the liquid through the needle, how to apply pressure just beneath the skin until the sting became warmth. "You will feel lighter," he promised. "You will be yourself again." And she did. The world blurred at the edges. The air grew soft and forgiving. The ticking of the clock no longer mocked her loneliness. The silence of her house no longer echoed with what she feared to think. Soon, she no longer waited for the doctor's visits. Her husband, ever the modern man, ordered extra supplies from the chemist just in case. He believed the medicine to be harmless, certainly more ladylike than brandy. And in truth, it suited her perfectly. The needle case fit neatly among her sewing tools. When visitors came, they found her serene, her complexion pale but radiant. "You look so calm," they said, and she smiled. Calm was the only thing she still knew how to be. But the calm required tending. Each morning she felt heavier until the first injection. Each evening, her nerves fluttered like frightened birds. She told herself she was managing it. After all, the doctor had said moderation was key. So she counted her doses, trimmed them when she could, and lied to herself when she couldn't. At night, as her children slept, she pricked her arm by the glow of the hearth, whispering a prayer for strength as the warmth spread through her veins. The servants noticed. Of course, they whispered about the lady's long naps, her absent gaze, the way she drifted through rooms like a ghost stitched into the wallpaper. Her husband noticed too, though he mistook her detachment for elegance, a certain ethereal refinement that suited the house. She was quieter now, less prone to tears, less alive. In time, the sewing table became her sanctuary. Each needle had its purpose, one for silk, one for linen, one for peace. She never confused them. The morphine made sure of that. By the end of the decade, London's chemists recorded an unexpected trend. Women, particularly those of means, were buying morphine in astonishing quantities. Doctors called it the malady of refinement. Society called it nothing at all. They preferred not to speak of women's suffering, especially when it looked so graceful. Behind lace curtains, thousands of ladies kept their needle cases close, tidy, elegant, and full of sleep. And if they sometimes trembled when the vial ran low, no one asked why. It was impolite to speak of dependency, better to call it composure, better to call it being well. When the last guns of Crimea fell silent, Britain congratulated itself on its victory. There were parades, speeches, medals polished and pinned to proud chests. But for the men who had fought in the mud and smoke of Sevastopol, the war did not end with peace treaties or ceremonies. It continued quietly, invisibly, inside their blood. They returned to a country that did not understand what they had become. The newspapers called them heroes. The physicians called them patients. Their families called them strangers. These were men who had seen limbs severed, comrades burned, and their own pain erased by the sharp mercy of a needle. They brought home the habit of silence and the craving for that silence. Morphine had been their salvation on the battlefield, but in the stillness of domestic life, it became the only war they knew how to fight. In military hospitals across the empire, new wards were opened for nervous exhaustion. The symptoms varied: trembling hands, sleeplessness, hollow eyes, sudden rage followed by deep despair. But one feature appeared in nearly every case: a quiet plea for relief. The doctors, still convinced that morphine was the safest balm, obliged. A few injections, a dose under the tongue, a measured kindness. It soothed their soldiers, kept them orderly. No one wanted to see a veteran begging in pain. They preferred him tranquil, even if it meant he could no longer feel. The letters began again. Old comrades wrote to one another, trading remedies the way they once traded ammunition. A dram of morphine before bed, one advised, and the cannon dreams cease. In taverns and barracks, the powder was passed like tobacco. Apothecaries near garrison towns learned to recognize the faces: proud men with medals on their coats, coins in their hands, and trembling in their voices. They came at dusk, ashamed to be seen, but unable to go without. Their wives learned to read the signs: the faraway stare, the faint smile that meant nothing, the slow drifting into sleep even in mid-conversation. Some tried to intervene, but found only rage or tears. Others joined them. Morphine became a shared language in households that had forgotten how to speak. A few, broken by guilt, sought help from the clergy. But even the priests were divided. Was this sin or sickness? Could one repent for needing mercy? By the 1860s, the army itself had begun to notice. Reports circulated of soldiers too weak to march, officers unfit for command. The phrase morphia habituae began appearing in the ledgers, the first bureaucratic acknowledgement of a moral collapse disguised as medical progress. Still, it remained a whisper. No one wished to stain the empire's triumph with talk of dependency. These men had survived hell. Surely they deserved a little peace. Yet, peace eluded them. Some overdosed quietly in rented rooms, their medals tucked into drawers. Others lived on, half awake, haunted not by what they'd seen in war, but by the numbness that followed. The pain of battle had been replaced by the pain of its absence, a hollow so vast that only morphine could fill it. And so the empire marched on, its soldiers ghosts in uniform, its victories embalmed in morphine's white dust. The war had ended, yes, but the battlefield had only changed shape. It now lay within the veins of the living. The handwriting was immaculate. Neat copperplate, black ink, the kind that reflected light when held just so. Each line told a story, though none were written as such. The ledgers of the great Victorian hospitals, Guy's Street, Bartholomew's, Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, were chronicles of mercy and denial, of cure and complicity. They recorded the rise of a generation of doctors who measured compassion by the drop and salvation by the grain. A physician's honor rested not in faith but in precision. The ledger was proof of both. 2 grains, morph, hydrochlor, patient agitated, half dose administered after fever. Injection successful, pain ceased. The words were clean, professional, detached. But the space between those lines was thick with the unspoken. Men who begged for more, women who trembled when the syringe was late, children who slept for 3 days and never woke. Each entry was a confession disguised as record-keeping. In 1863, Dr. Charles Ambrose of King's College Hospital began an experiment he believed would revolutionize pain management. He tracked 50 surgical patients, treated exclusively with morphine, documenting dosage, mood, recovery time. For months, his results dazzled the medical community. Patients healed faster. Wounds stayed clean. The hospital wards were quieter than they'd ever been. Nurses spoke of serenity. Surgeons called it progress. Ambrose, meticulous as a clockmaker, filled page after page with praise for the miracle alkaloid. But in the margins, the first cracks appeared, notes written smaller, tighter, as though ashamed of themselves. Patient, restless, demands second dose prematurely. Symptoms of weakness and fainting. Then darker ones still. Patient deceased during night, respiration ceased. He underlined that word twice. It was the only time his pen shook. Yet he continued. The next morning's entry began as before. Dosage, repeated patient, calm. Other doctors followed his lead, eager to match his success. Morphine became the new measure of modernity. To practice without it was to cling to the past. And so the ledgers multiplied, rows upon rows of miracles catalogued in perfect ink. The hospitals grew quieter, but beneath the calm, a strange malaise settled in. Patients no longer wept or shouted. They simply faded, their vitality exchanged for stillness. Nurses began to whisper among themselves that the wards had become too silent. They die too peacefully, one said, like they forget to fight. But when these worries reached the doctors' rooms, they were dismissed with irritation. It is the nature of progress, said Ambrose. We are learning to tame suffering. The price is silence. Years later, when those ledgers were examined again, they read like elegies. Hundreds of names crossed out, each followed by a final notation, expired. Some had survived their surgeries, only to perish weeks later at home, their veins quietly demanding what their physicians had taught them to crave. Others lingered for years, their lives bound by the rhythm of the needle. The ledgers remained immaculate, their pages free of blood, their margins whispering the truth only ink could hide. The doctors called it documentation. History would call it something else entirely, the first written proof of addiction born not in the alley, but in the ward. Each elegant signature at the bottom of the page was a monument to the same illusion, that mercy could be measured, that pain could be erased without consequence. The handwriting never wavered, even as the empire's pulse began to. Before morphine gleamed in glass, there had been laudanum, the dark, viscous ancestor of all Victorian comforts. It was the old world's lullaby, a tincture of opium dissolved in sherry and sweetened with syrup, sold by every apothecary from London to Calcutta. For centuries, it had been the faithful friend of poets and paupers alike. Mothers gave it to their infants to hush the night's crying. Gentlemen took it for gout, ladies for melancholy, sailors for sleep. Its bottle was the quiet constant in every home, its red label as familiar as the family Bible. By the time morphine appeared, laudanum had already prepared the soil. The British were a nation accustomed to chemical grace. Pain, sorrow, hunger, and shame all could be softened by a spoonful of amber liquid. It blurred the edges of life's indignities and left the drinker pleasantly detached from the world's cold logic. The poets praised it openly. Coleridge, De Quincey, Elizabeth Barrett Browning each turned their dependence into literature, romanticizing the very substance that hollowed them. The sleep of angels, they called it. Society listened and believed. When morphine arrived, it did not replace laudanum, it refined it. The Victorians trusted refinement. They believed that progress could purify even sin. Morphine was the civilized form of indulgence, the scientific distillation of a peasant's solace. Where laudanum had been messy and slow, morphine was sterile and swift. A man no longer needed to stumble through intoxication to find relief. He could inject serenity directly into his veins and still attend church the next morning. The pharmacies sold both, side by side. On one shelf, laudanum for the poor, a copper a bottle. On the next, morphine in glass ampoules for the discerning patient, neatly wrapped in tissue and ribbon. The same comfort, separated by class and clarity. The poor took their medicine with a spoon. The rich preferred a syringe. Both called it necessity. But the ghost of laudanum never left. Morphine carried its memory, the soft decay, the slow erosion of will, the quiet deception of feeling well. Old addicts shifted easily to the new drug, telling themselves it was safer, modern, even healthful. Doctors encouraged the transition. Morphine, they said, lacks the vulgar intoxication of opium. It refines the mind while easing the body. They did not notice how quickly their patients returned, pale and pleading, their voices trembling with the same familiar hunger. In the slums of London, laudanum bottles still rolled beneath beds, half empty, beside newspapers and broken shoes. In Mayfair, silver syringes gleamed beside perfume and lace. Both told the same story, a nation that had learned to love its numbness. By the late 1860s, England had become a country of contradictions. It preached discipline and self-control, yet consumed enough opiates to numb an empire. The chemists knew the truth, but kept their ledgers tidy. The doctors saw it, but called it progress. And through it all, laudanum remained in the background, a mother's comfort, a poet's muse, a laborer's rest whispering to its more elegant descendant. I was here first. Morphine was the future, yes, but its soul was old, inherited, steeped in the amber sleep of generations. The Victorians did not invent addiction. They simply gave it better manners. By the middle of the 19th century, Britain ruled not only the seas but the veins of half the world. Its empire stretched from the factories of Manchester to the poppy fields of Bengal, each feeding the other in a perfect, terrible circle. Cotton, coal, sugar, and now opium moved through the ports of empire with the same bureaucratic precision. Morphine, that gleaming miracle of European chemistry, had joined the list of imperial exports. What began as a battlefield remedy had become a commodity, as valuable as tea and as invisible as sin. Ships from Calcutta and Bombay docked in London with cargoes of raw opium destined for refinement. In return, British vessels carried the processed alkaloids back east, stamped with labels that read, for medical use only. Behind those polite words hid a truth few dared to speak. The empire had found its newest form of control. It was not a whip or a rifle that kept colonies compliant, but a bottle. In India, British doctors distributed morphine freely among regiments and hospitals, calling it the elixir of progress. The native orderlies learned to mix and inject it, believing it a mark of modern medicine. In the military hospitals of Calcutta and Rangoon, men lay in neat rows, drifting in identical dreams. The officers praised the discipline of their soldiers, unaware that their calm was not loyalty but chemical peace. Meanwhile, in London, the drug flowed upward through society like invisible smoke. Soldiers returned from war with quiet habits that spread faster than rumor. A single officer, once decorated for valor, could introduce morphine to an entire gentleman's club. From there, it reached drawing rooms, writers' desks, and even the pulpit. Pain was universal, and morphine was its polite solution. The empire fed on paradox. In China, British merchants waged war to force the sale of opium, preaching free trade, while condemning Chinese addiction as moral decay. In England, those same merchants dined on gold earned from the trade, their wives sipping diluted laudanum for their nerves. What the empire inflicted abroad, it indulged at home. By the 1870s, morphine was no longer confined to hospitals. It was being marketed across the colonies as an emblem of civilization. Advertisements promised the end of savage suffering and European comfort in tropical lands. The drug became a symbol of the imperial mission itself, bringing calm to chaos, order to pain. But in the huts of Bengal and the tea plantations of Ceylon, new ghosts began to rise. Men who had taken the white medicine to ease fevers now could not work without it. Women pawned their jewelry for vials. Children were born pale and trembling. Back in Britain, the government ignored these reports. The empire's prosperity depended too deeply on the poppy's sap. A crop that dulled pain also silenced dissent, and so the trade continued, clothed in the language of progress. Doctors called it medical advancement. Politicians called it economics. Historians would later call it hypocrisy. Every empire has its opium, its means of keeping the world quiet. For Britain, it was literal, a substance that could make a soldier obey, a colony submit, a nation sleep. The empire built on industry was sustained by dreams, by morphine, measured, refined, and sanctified in the name of mercy. No one yet called it a curse, not while it still wore the mask of civilization. London, 1868. The wards of St. Thomas's were immaculate whitewashed walls, iron beds lined in perfect symmetry, floors scrubbed until the smell of disinfectant hung like a sermon in the air. The great hospitals of the capital had become cathedrals of science, their halls filled not with prayer but with the steady hiss of gas lamps and the metallic click of instruments being cleaned. To walk through them at night was to hear the empire breathing through its wounds. Yet beneath the order and discipline, something eerie had taken root. The hospitals no longer dreamed. Night rounds had once been filled with noise, groans, coughs, the restless turning of bodies that could not find peace. But now, after the triumph of morphine, a strange silence ruled. Patients lay motionless under their thin blankets, eyes half open, faces smooth as wax. The nurses moved quietly between them, checking pulses, changing dressings, whispering the same refrain. Rest, my dear, rest. They told themselves it was mercy. They told each other the silence meant healing. The senior surgeon, Mr. William Gascoigne, recorded the new atmosphere with pride. "The wards are at last civilized," he wrote. "No cries, no panic. We have achieved control over pain." Each evening, he supervised the mixing of morphine, dissolving the white crystals into warm water before handing the vials to the nurses like communion cups. "One measure for the soldier, half for the child," he instructed. "We are learning to mend without cruelty." and the staff believed him, because the stillness looked so much like peace, but there were signs that peace had teeth. Some patients began to wither, their appetites gone, their sleep turning too deep. They woke trembling, drenched in sweat, whispering for more of the draught. The nurses tried to hide it from Gascoigne. They feared his disappointment more than the patient's decline. They called it the night fever, pretending it was a common malady, though they knew the truth. When the morphine was withheld, the quiet ward became a place of trembling and screams. When it was given again, calm returned, silence restored. The doctors called it balance, the nurses called it deliverance, but it was dependency wearing a white sheet. Visitors to the hospital were moved by what they saw. They sleep so peacefully, one philanthropist remarked. Medicine has at last conquered suffering. Donations poured in. The newspapers wrote glowing articles about the age of anesthesia. No one mentioned that half the patients could not leave their beds without the needles whisper in their veins. Sometimes, on particularly long nights, Nurse Evelyn Marwood would pause at the far end of the ward and look down the long corridor of cots. 40 men, 40 pale faces, all breathing in perfect rhythm. It reminded her of the churchyard at dawn. She wondered, though she dared not speak it, whether this new medicine was easing to them toward life or toward a gentler kind of death. By morning, the routine resumed. Doses recorded, ledgers signed, praise delivered. Gascoigne called it progress. The nurses called it mercy. The silence, however, called it something else entirely. It was not peace that ruled the hospital now, it was numbness. And numbness, once it takes hold of a nation, does not stay within the ward. It seeps outward into the streets, the homes, the bloodstream of an empire learning to mistake stillness for health. By the 1870s, morphine had crossed from the sick room to the smoking room. It was no longer the province of the wounded or the desperate, but of the refined. In the gaslit clubs of Pall Mall, among the smell of cigars and port, gentlemen discussed politics, poetry, and medicine with equal authority. The syringe had become an accessory of intellect, as essential to the modern man as his pocket watch or fountain pen. Pain, both physical and moral, was considered uncouth. The new generation of Englishmen preferred composure, and morphine provided it. It began innocently, a stiff shoulder, a restless mind, a doctor's assurance that a little morphia will restore one's equilibrium. The Victorian physician, ever eager to soothe his social betters, prescribed the drug as one might recommend a tonic, to be taken in moderation, the instructions read, though moderation was a matter of opinion. A gentleman prided himself on control of his estate, his servants, his family, and, now, his own emotions. Morphine simply made the performance easier. At first, the habit was hidden behind elegance. Silver syringe sets were sold by London jewelers, monogrammed and lined with velvet. Bottles of morphine powder bore labels in French, as though foreign language alone could make it respectable. A discreet injection before supper steadied the nerves. Another before bed ensured a restful night. Those who indulged too freely were said to suffer from fatigue of the intellect or nervous prostration, but never addiction. Addiction was a word reserved for the poor. The upper class, after all, did not succumb to vice, they refined it. In the great houses of Belgravia, guests would retire after dinner not to smoke, but to take the draught. Conversation grew slower, laughter softer. The room filled with the faint scent of spirits and sugar, the ritual carried out behind embroidered screens. A gentleman must not lose his composure, one barrister was heard to say, as he prepared his evening dose. Morphine is not a vice, it is a defense. And so it was a defense against the noise of the city, against anxiety, against life itself. But beneath the polish, the same quiet ruin unfolded. Men began missing appointments, forgetting names, neglecting debts. They blamed overwork, bad weather, the air of London. Some withdrew entirely from society, writing long, meandering letters to their physicians that were never posted. Others died suddenly in their studies, found with a book in one hand and the syringe in the other. Their obituaries spoke of apoplexy or a weak heart. Respect demanded euphemism. The apothecaries knew the truth. They saw the same faces return each week, paler, more frantic, always asking for more medicine for the nerves. Some pharmacists began selling by the case, quietly arranging delivery through footmen who never met their employers' eyes. The transactions were unspoken: contracts, discretion for profit, silence for survival. By the decade's end, the habit had seeped into the bloodstream of English respectability. Ministers took it before sermons, writers before inspiration, judges before passing sentence. Morphine had become the lubricant of civilization, invisible, essential, and deadly. London, that great heart of empire, beat to a new rhythm, now slower, softer, numbed by the same chemical that had once silenced soldiers in the field. And as the gentlemen of England slept behind their curtains, the empire itself began to drowse with them, dreaming a dream from which it would be slow to wake. Grief in the Victorian age had its own etiquette, its own wardrobe, its own schedule, its own language of silence. A widow was expected to mourn for 2 full years, her body draped in crape, her speech subdued to whispers. She could not dance, nor laugh, nor attend a public gathering. Society demanded dignity from her pain, elegance from her despair. But dignity is difficult to maintain when the nights will not end and the heart will not still. For that, there was morphine. It entered the home quietly, as most respectable vices did a physician's visit. A sympathetic word, a small glass vial left on the nightstand beside the black-bordered letters of condolence. For the nerves, he would say gently, to calm the trembling and help you sleep. And at first, it worked as promised. A few drops, and the body grew light. The relentless ache in her chest softened. The room blurred. And for the first time since the funeral, she could breathe without remembering why she wished she couldn't. Morphine became part of the widow's routine, as natural as prayer. A morning dose to face the day's visitors, a larger one at dusk when memory crept back with the fog. Her servants noticed the transformation. "Madam seems herself again," they would whisper. Her cheeks regained color, her voice steadied. The doctor called it recovery. Only she knew it was surrender not to madness, but to peace. Letters from this time reveal a strange intimacy between the bereaved and their medicine. One woman wrote in her diary, "The bottle is my confidant now. It never speaks, never judges." Another called morphine, "My husband's ghost made kind." The line between memory and oblivion blurred. What began as solace became devotion. The widows of London, Bath, and Edinburgh formed a quiet congregation, each alone, yet bound by the same secret sacrament. Society did not condemn them. A woman's sorrow was private property, not a public concern. And if she appeared composed, if her grief was tidy, her demeanor gentle, her voice steady, then surely the medicine had done its job. No one questioned the tremor in her hand or the long hours she spent behind closed doors. The ideal Victorian widow was pale, tranquil, untouchable. Morphine made her that way. But as months turned to years, the comfort began to rot. The doses grew larger, the nights longer. Some widows stopped leaving their houses altogether. Curtains stayed drawn, meals untouched, conversations avoided. Morphine dulled pain, but it also erased the world. One lady of Kent was found dead at her dressing table, still in mourning black, her needle lying neatly beside her silver comb. The coroner recorded the cause as excess of grief. He was not wrong, only incomplete. By the late 1870s, the phrase, "the widow's comfort," had become a euphemism in medical circles, whispered between doctors who understood its double meaning. They saw it everywhere, the sleepless, the sorrowful, the refined. Women who once embodied grace now drifted through life like echoes. The Victorian widow had learned how to mourn without madness, how to suffer without sound. And in that silence, morphine flourished. For a society that prized composure above all else, it was the perfect drug. It made grief beautiful. It made despair acceptable. It made women disappear without ever leaving their homes. They returned in uniforms that no longer fit, medals pinned to hollow chests, their boots clean but their eyes far away. The veterans of the Empire's wars, Crimea, India, Afghanistan, walked the streets of London like echoes of a storm. The crowds saluted them, offered drinks, called them heroes, but when the toasts were over and the laughter faded, the soldiers drifted home to lodgings that smelled of damp cloth and old dreams. They carried nothing from the front except their scars, their nightmares, and the tiny vials of morphine tucked deep in their pockets. For the wounded, the drug had been a miracle. It stopped the spasms, soothed the phantom pain of missing limbs, drowned out the memory of comrades screaming in the mud. At first, it seemed to return them to life, but life, once reclaimed, felt intolerably sharp. The world was too bright, too loud, too full of reminders that refused to fade. When they closed their eyes, the battlefield returned, horses plunging through, smoke, blood blooming on snow. The surgeons saw. They reached, instinctively, for the syringe. In barracks and hospital hostels, veterans gathered like parishioners in an invisible church. They called each other by old ranks, captain, sergeant, private, and passed the morphine around like communion. It was not pleasure they sought, but reprieve. The injections became ritual. Before sleep, before conversation, before memory could awaken. They spoke in murmurs about the quiet it brought, the stillness after the thunder. Some joked that morphine was the only comrade who'd never abandoned them. Doctors, seeing their condition, offered sympathy but little understanding. War strain, they called it, or nervous collapse. Morphine remained the prescribed remedy, a drop to steady the mind. The irony was unbearable. The cure for their pain was the very thing prolonging it. But no one dared to stop the prescriptions. These were decorated men, symbols of courage. To accuse them of weakness was to question the empire itself. Their wives and mothers watched helplessly as the transformation took hold. The veterans became shadows, their tempers brief, their sleep restless. Some awoke in the night, clutching imaginary rifles. Others stared for hours at walls no one else could see. They called it the morphine fog, a place where past and present bled together. A man could walk there for years without ever noticing he was lost. The taverns near the docks filled with them ex-soldiers sitting alone, sleeves rolled up, a faraway look that made other patrons uneasy. A few worked odd jobs, their wages spent mostly at the chemist. Many ended their days in poorhouses, or as nameless bodies pulled from the Thames, a syringe still in their coat. The papers reported melancholy among veterans, but rarely asked why. In truth, they had never come home. Their souls had been left on foreign soil, embalmed in morphine. The empire that had sent them to fight for glory now fed their ghosts with the same drug that silenced their screams. When they gathered in the evenings, the talk always circled back to the same refrain. "We were lucky," one would say, rolling up his sleeve. "We survived." But in the dim light of the pub, their faces said otherwise. The war had ended, yes, but in their blood it marched on, relentless and eternal, drumming through their veins like a memory that refused to die. She was radiant on her wedding day, though pale a fashionable pallor, the newspapers would have said. Beneath the lace veil and the scent of lilies, her pulse fluttered like a trapped bird. The guests admired her poise, her serenity, the graceful stillness with which she accepted the vows. None could see the faint bruise on her arm, hidden beneath the glove. She had been given a restorative that morning by her physician, just a small injection to steady her nerves, to keep her from fainting before the ceremony. The doctor called it a drop of courage. The bride called it deliverance. It began long before the wedding. Girls of her class were often frail by design, corseted too tightly, educated to be delicate, protected from everything except expectation. They were told that anxiety was unladylike, that emotions should be laced up as firmly as their gowns, so when sleeplessness, palpitations, or melancholy struck, the family doctor came with his black bag and his quiet authority. He prescribed morphine for the nerves, a harmless sedative, he said, quite modern, quite safe. It was the age's solution to femininity itself. The young woman's life changed. The headaches faded. Her mood softened. Her mother called her improved. Her fiancé said she seemed seraphic. She felt suspended between worlds, not happy, but relieved of unhappiness. Her smiles came easily now, though they never reached her eyes. The doctor visited weekly, adjusting her dosage as one might tend a garden. "We must keep the balance," he said gently, "between vitality and repose." She nodded, never realizing that repose was beginning to replace vitality altogether. Marriage did not cure her. The city was heavy with expectation, dinner parties, social calls, charity visits. The strain of being admired was immense. On nights when her thoughts grew sharp and unbearable, she turned to the needle again. Her husband approved. He found her quietness soothing. The injections became part of her toilette, along with perfume and pearls, the final touch before she stepped into society's gaze. "My darling," he would say, "you are always so calm." And she was. That was the tragedy of it. Soon the morphine was not a supplement to her days, but the structure of them. She took it before writing letters, before walking in the park, before enduring the long hours of afternoon boredom that her class mistook for refinement. Her maid began to assist discreetly, preparing the syringe as she prepared the tea. It was domestic ritual, disguised as devotion. Then came the pregnancies that did not last, the fainting, the bleeding, the quiet funerals no one mentioned. Morphine, prescribed again and again to ease her recovery, took more from her than it gave. By her 25th year, the bride who had once glowed with delicate promise had faded into translucence. She was beautiful still, but in the way of things already half remembered. In the hospitals, doctors began noticing a pattern: women of good birth, pale and trembling, who could not live without their injections. They called it the feminine affliction and blamed fragile constitutions rather than the cure itself. Society pitied them, even envied their refinement. No one saw the quiet horror of it, that the empire's daughters were being embalmed alive, their grace purchased by numbness. The morphine bride was not a scandal. She was a symbol of poise, of gentility, of an age that mistook serenity for virtue. And in her sleep, the empire dreamed with her still, beautiful, and quietly dying. By the 1880s, the journals of medicine had become psalms of self-congratulation. The Lancet, the British Medical Journal, and countless provincial bulletins, printed columns filled with new discoveries: cocaine for fatigue, chloroform for childbirth, morphine for nearly everything else. Each article promised mastery over suffering, as if pain itself were an outdated superstition. Physicians quoted statistics like scripture. Patients treated with morphia sleep soundly, recovery accelerated, mortality reduced. The numbers were clean. The reality was not. In hospital wards, morphine was everywhere. It glimmered in glass bottles beside scalpels and bandages, administered for fever, for melancholy, for hysteria of the female temperament. No ailment seemed beyond its reach. Doctors spoke of it reverently, as though it were a sacrament of progress, the scientific triumph that separated their enlightened century from the darkness before anesthesia. They saw in it not drug, but a philosophy, that the mind, when disciplined by chemistry, could be purified of chaos. The medical schools followed suit. Young men in crisp coats watched as their professors demonstrated the perfect injection, the angle, the dosage, the calm tone of reassurance. It is the duty of the physician, they were told, to spare his patient unnecessary pain. The phrase unnecessary pain became the cornerstone of modern medicine, though no one could agree where necessity ended. Some began to wonder, quietly, whether any pain was necessary anymore. Doctors competed for innovation. publishing case studies that bordered on confession. A woman of 30, afflicted with nervous exhaustion, relieved immediately by morphia injection. A laborer with frostbite, rendered docile and grateful after 2 grains administered. A poet overcome with insomnia, sleeps now without dreams. They did not see addiction taking root. They called it compliance. When patients returned pale and pleading, the records labeled them recurrent cases. If a man collapsed after his 10th dose, the fault lay in his constitution, not in the needle. Pharmaceutical firms fed this faith. German companies like Merck and Bayer printed elegant catalogues displaying crystalline morphine under the heading Essentials of the Modern Clinic. They sent free samples to physicians, along with pamphlets written in the tone of missionary zeal. To relieve is to redeem, one declared. The age of suffering is at an end. British doctors, ever cautious in moral tone, agreed. They believed they were civilizing pain itself, taming it, as Britain had tamed continents. Yet outside the pages of their journals, the world was softening in strange ways. The wounded no longer wept. The poor no longer cried out in infirmaries. The rich no longer confessed their despair. The city was quieter but not kinder. Nurses described the wards as peaceful as graves. Undertakers, in turn, noted an increase in sudden deaths, patients who passed peacefully in the night. The doctors called this merciful conclusion. The newspapers called it progress. No one dared publish the suspicion that whispered through the corridors that morphine had not banished suffering at all, merely transformed it. Pain had become invisible, buried beneath a chemical calm. Humanity was being anesthetized, one injection at a time. In the age of forgetting, medicine no longer healed the body. It erased it. And as London drifted deeper into its quiet, narcotized dream, the world mistook the silence for peace, not realizing it was the sound of everything slipping away. They still held parades for them, the Crimean survivors, the Indian campaigners, the veterans of the Afghan hills, rows of men in faded uniforms, medals dull with tarnish, their boots barely keeping time to the drums. Crowds clapped and cheered, tossing flowers, shouting, "Heroes!" But behind every stiff salute and weary smile, the same hollow look lingered, the quiet vacancy of men who had long since surrendered to something invisible. Morphine had given them life after war, but it had taken everything that made life bearable. In the soldiers' hospitals, the silence was worse than any battle. The orderlies moved carefully between cots, whispering instructions, their voices swallowed by the stillness of men half sleeping, half fading. The air smelled of alcohol, rust, and despair. Some patients stared endlessly at the ceiling, blinking only when the lamplight flickered. Others mumbled prayers to no god at all. Their bodies had healed, their spirits had not. Doctors called it post-traumatic exhaustion or nervous collapse. They prescribed more of the same salvation that caused it. A small injection will restore morale, they said, handing the syringes to nurses, already haunted by the sight of too many steady hands turning trembling. Morphine dulled the tremors, softened the nightmares, made the wards quieter, and for a brief time, that was enough. The army preferred its veterans calm. The nation preferred them invisible. Pension records from the period tell the rest. Thousands of soldiers dismissed from active duty for indolence, habitual weakness, or loss of discipline. Few mentioned the drug that had followed them from the front lines to their kitchens. They called it the medicine, a comfort, a necessity, something that made it possible to sleep without seeing the faces of the dead. Their wives sometimes tried to hide the vials, but the withdrawal was cruel, shaking, vomiting, screaming. Eventually, pity won over resolve, and the bottle returned to the bedside. One former sergeant, Arthur Gale, kept a diary in the years after his discharge. In it, the handwriting grew smaller and more erratic with each entry. May 1869. Slept well. Injection before bed, all calm. June 2nd. Pain in leg, unbearable. Took 2 doses. Peaceful. July 14th. Pain less now, but mind uneasy without it. August 1st. I do not feel myself unless I am still. He died that winter. The doctor's note read, heart failure due to exhaustion. His widow never learned that the exhaustion was of the soul. Elsewhere, in almshouses and veterans' homes, the same pattern repeated. The once proud soldiers of empire sat in rows before the hearth, nodding slowly into stupor. The attendants called it rest, the chaplains called it mercy, but it was neither. It was the slow erasure of a generation men who had fought for queen and country, now conquered by the very medicine meant to heal them. The newspapers printed sentimental obituaries. He died peacefully, surrounded by friends. The public wept for their bravery, but the truth went unspoken. These were not peaceful deaths. They were chemical farewells. Morphine had stolen the pain, and with it, the last proof that they had ever lived. The empire would decorate their graves with stone lions and Latin mottos, never realizing that beneath those carved tributes lay the first casualties of a new kind of war, one fought not with bullets, but with needles. It was a war no one would remember, because its victims had already forgotten themselves. The word began as a rumor, a whisper traded between doctors behind closed doors, or printed carefully between commas in the medical press. Addict. It was an ugly word, foreign, un-English, borrowed from the Latin addicere, meaning to surrender, to devote oneself. The Victorians had no language for surrender. They preferred words like nervous, indisposed, or indulgent. But by the 1880s, something darker had entered the city's bloodstream, and no euphemism could disguise it. London was a city lit by gas and shadow. In the chemist's windows, the vials of morphine glowed faintly under lamplight, lined up like glass soldiers. Each one promised relief, and each one demanded devotion. Behind those doors, the whisper spread of patients who could not stop returning, of respectable ladies trembling at dawn, of officers pawning their medals for another vial. The apothecaries called it habit. The doctors called it moral weakness. Only the afflicted called it truth. The first official report appeared in the Lancet in 1883. It described a physician unnamed who had begun injecting morphine to relieve his own migraines. The effect was heavenly, the article quoted, but heaven requires maintenance. Within months, the man was dosing himself daily, then hourly. When he tried to stop, his body revolted chills, sweat, a sense of terror that bordered on madness. His colleagues observed the symptoms with scientific curiosity, not empathy. The subject demonstrates a remarkable dependency, one wrote, as though describing a specimen rather than a man unraveling. Outside the hospital walls, addiction spread faster than the doctor's understanding. Pharmacies reported shortages. Street chemists began to sell diluted forms under new names. Sleeping solution, nerve tonic, angel drops. Morphine moved through the city like gossip, respectable in daylight, shameful after dusk. The poor bought it by the spoon, the wealthy by the ounce, and beneath the polite conversation of drawing rooms and clinics, the same whisper persisted. Addict. The word frightened people. It suggested something irreversible, something contagious. Moralists seized on it, preaching that addiction was not a disease, but a decay of character. Sermons thundered about the soft corruption of the body and the idolatry of pleasure. Parliament debated restrictions, but balked at the idea of limiting medicine, especially one so essential to commerce, comfort, and empire. To question morphine was to question progress itself. The addicts learned to live in the gaps between these hypocrisies. They hid their syringes in sewing kits, their vials behind books, their tremors behind politeness. In the gaslit evenings, they walked the streets in pairs, pale men and women bound by an unspoken fellowship of longing. Some gathered in private rooms above apothecaries, helping one another through the dreadful nights of abstinence. They called themselves the cured, though most relapsed before dawn. London had grown quieter in those years, almost reverent. The gaslights flickered on each evening. their glow reflected in the puddles along Fleet Street, where doctors hurried home with their cases and patients waited at chemists' doors for their next reprieve. The city no longer screamed, no longer wept. It hummed softly, like a living thing in withdrawal. And in that hush, the word addict took root, whispered under the breath of nurses, written in the margins of ledgers, muttered by wives who feared what their husbands had become. It was a small word, but heavy, the weight of a century's denial pressed into 6 letters. A confession the empire would never make aloud, that its progress had a pulse, and that pulse was trembling. The Victorians liked to believe that mercy could be measured, that suffering, when properly quantified, could be subtracted from the human experience. They had dissected the body into organs, the mind into symptoms, the soul into nerves. Now they sought to dissect compassion itself. And nowhere was this experiment more evident than in the wards where morphine reigned. It was the perfect embodiment of the age's moral paradox, a chemical kindness that demanded obedience, a mercy that left the merciful blind. To ease another's suffering was seen as virtue. To question the method, heresy. The syringe had become a symbol of the physician's benevolence, the proof of his modernity. Each injection was a small act of godhood, the power to calm, to silence, to erase pain at will. The Victorians, obsessed with moral order, mistook numbness for grace. Dr. Samuel Phipps of Street, Mary's Hospital, kept a private journal during his decades of practice. His entries reveal a man torn between duty and doubt. "They beg for it," he wrote in 1877. "I see the desperation in their eyes and cannot refuse. Yet I wonder, is this truly mercy, or is it murder conducted in fractions?" He recorded the deaths of 3 long-term patients that year. All expired quietly in sleep. He never stopped prescribing. "One must be humane," he concluded, "even when humanity becomes complicity." Such doubts were rare. The medical establishment thrived on certainty. Morphine was not merely a treatment, but a theology, a faith in science as the redeemer of pain. Hospitals hung posters celebrating the conquest of agony. Public lectures praised the drug as evidence of civilization's progress. "We have liberated mankind from the tyranny of pain," declared one speaker at the Royal Society in 1885. The audience applauded, unaware that dozens of the same society's members were themselves privately dependent on the very drug they contentities praised. In homes across Britain, the logic of mercy trickled downward. Parents soothed feverish children with opiate syrups, their ingredients proudly printed on the label: morphine, laudanum, camphor. Housewives dosed themselves to suppress nerves. Employers recommended it to overworked clerks. Pain had become not just intolerable but unfashionable, an embarrassment in a world striving for composure. The clergy, too, struggled to define the line between comfort and corruption. Some declared morphine a divine gift, proof that God allows man to share in his healing hand. Others saw it as temptation, incarnate. One London preacher warned his flock that when man dares to command suffering itself, he risks usurping the cross. Yet even his words were undermined when his own parish nurse was found to keep a syringe in her pocket for holy purposes. The irony of the age was cruel. The more they sought to banish pain, the less they understood it. Morphine's mercy was absolute. It forgave everything, erased everything, asked nothing, and in its silence, the Victorians lost the language of endurance. By the century's end, an entire culture had been anesthetized. Its hospitals glowed with progress, its citizens slept in the arms of chemical pity, and its conscience, dulled by the soft hum of syringes, forgot that pain, for all its cruelty, had once been the proof of life itself. Mercy, they believed, had triumphed. But mercy, when stripped of understanding, becomes indistinguishable from oblivion. In churches across Victorian England, the pews were full and the prayers were fervent. But faith had begun to tremble beneath the weight of modern medicine. For centuries, suffering had been considered sacred, a test of endurance, a bridge between man and God. Pain had purpose. It purified, it humbled. But now, in the age of morphine, even suffering had a cure, and that cure came not from heaven but from the chemist's shelf. The white powder was replacing the cross. Sermons turned anxious. Preachers who once thundered about sin now whispered about science. Pain, one clergyman warned, is the soul's crucible. Remove it, and man forgets how to repent. Yet his congregation was unmoved. They had seen pain conquered by glass vials, by steady hands, by the hush of hospital wards that once echoed with screams. To them, the physician had become a kind of priest, his syringe a modern relic. When he bent over the suffering and delivered the sting that led to peace, it looked very much like salvation. In rural parishes, where the lines between doctor and preacher blurred, the two professions began to trade their vestments. Clergymen carried morphine to comfort the dying. Doctors quoted scripture about mercy. The boundaries of faith and flesh dissolved in the name of compassion. Parish records show the spread of medical ministries, small church-funded programs that distributed morphine to the sick and destitute. It was charity. They said God's work made efficient. The poor thanked the church for its mercy, unaware that the mercy was teaching them how to crave. The missionaries carried this gospel farther still. In India, Africa, and the South Pacific, they preached Christ's redemption alongside the wonders of Western medicine. Our Savior brings peace to the soul, they would tell the villagers, and this medicine brings peace to the body. The two became indistinguishable. Morphine was the new miracle, its name invoked with reverence in the same breath as prayer. A gift from God through the hands of man, wrote Reverend Jonathan Hales in his diary while traveling through Bengal, though one must dose it carefully, lest mercy turn to sin. Yet sin was precisely what many began to suspect. By the late 1880s, a quiet rebellion stirred in pulpits. Evangelical papers warned that the age's obsession with comfort had eroded moral discipline. "We have made pain unholy," one article declared. "We have robbed the soul of its confession." Still, the pews were filled with men and women whose veins hummed with morphine's calm. To them, sermons on temperance sounded quaint, almost cruel. They did not wish to return to pain. Among the dying, the white powder was most adored. Priests found themselves competing with doctors for the final moments of the faithful. "Shall I pray with you?" they would ask, kneeling by the bed. "Later," came the whisper, "after the injection." And, after the injection, there was no need for prayer. The peace had already descended. The clergy tried to reclaim suffering as sacred, but the age of anesthesia had rewritten its theology. Pain was no longer redemptive. It was a failure of treatment. Faith, stripped of agony, grew comfortable, and comfort is the most seductive heresy of all. In the churchyards of England, crosses stood over countless graves inscribed with the same gentle epitaph. He died peacefully, but beneath those stones lay not saints, nor martyrs, nor sinners seeking forgiveness, only bodies stilled by a chemical grace, their last prayer answered not by heaven, but by a hand holding the syringe. The streets of London were a carnival of promises. Posters plastered on brick walls shouted salvation in bold fonts. Dr. Bliss's restorative elixir, the great American sleep cure, Mrs. Fenton's soothing syrup for ladies and infants. Horse-drawn carts rolled through the fog carrying wooden crates filled with colored bottles, each one promising comfort in liquid form. Pain had become a market, and the empire was buying. By the 1880s, morphine had slipped its medical collar and joined the traveling circus of patent medicines. It was no longer confined to hospitals or chemists' drawers. It had become a commodity, branded and bottled, sold by peddlers who wore silk hats and smiles as wide as the Thames. They toured the industrial towns where soot blackened the lungs and spirits of the working poor, promising gentle relief for a few pennies a dose. The secret ingredient was never revealed. though every label contained the same lie, purely herbal. The advertisements were works of art and deceit. One broadside showed a mother cradling her child beneath the words, "Sleep, sweet babe, sleep." Another depicted a weary laborer clasping his heart in gratitude after drinking Dr. Ainsworth's invincible tonic. The recipes varied: a little sugar, a splash of alcohol, but the true miracle lay in the white powder stirred quietly beneath it all. Morphine, opium, laudanum, the invisible chorus of the age. The government knew, but regulation moved slower than profit. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 had tried to restrain dangerous substances, but enforcement was impossible in a nation where half the population took medicine daily. And besides, who could forbid comfort? Parliament debated restrictions, while the factories of Birmingham and Manchester turned out bottles by the thousand. The line between medicine and merchandise blurred until it disappeared entirely. Women bought tonics for female troubles. Factory men drank mixtures for nerve fatigue. Children were given syrups for teething that contained enough morphine to still their cries, and sometimes their hearts. The dead infants were mourned quietly, their mothers told they had been too delicate to survive. No one blamed the syrup. It had come from a bottle printed with angels and gold lettering. Surely something so beautiful could not be deadly. Meanwhile, the sellers grew rich. Quack doctors built fortunes, opening grand shops on Regent Street and Piccadilly, each adorned with gilt mirrors and marble counters. They spoke of science, though few had studied it. "We bring peace to the people," one proclaimed to a newspaper reporter. "Would you deny the poor man comfort?" His conscience was as spotless as his waistcoat. By night, the alleyways of Whitechapel glimmered with discarded bottles, their corks gone, their labels half torn by the rain. The same bottles appeared in drawing-room wastebaskets, emptied by women too, ashamed to admit what they needed to sleep. The rich called it tonic dependence. The poor called it rest. The streets sang with advertisements, but beneath the music lay a different rhythm, the pulse of a nation intoxicated by its own invention. The patent medicine boom had transformed the British body into a laboratory of commerce, its veins running with the profits of progress. And so the parade marched on, glittering, prosperous, and blind, its banners proclaiming health, its footsteps echoing toward decay. Every bottle was a sermon, every label a lie. Yet the crowd cheered louder, desperate to believe that comfort could be bought and bottled, that pain could be packaged, priced, and politely swallowed. The empire, after all, had always been good at selling dreams. The newspapers called it a crisis of domestic nerves. Behind the lace curtains and tidy facades of Victorian streets, England's homes had become quiet battlegrounds, not of muskets and bayonets, but of bottles, needles, and silence. The wars abroad had forged a nation of patience. Now the war at home was fought in the parlors and bedrooms of the newly civilized world. It began, as all tragedies did, with good intentions. The chemist's cabinet had become as essential to a household as the Bible or the clock on the mantel. Mothers kept their bottles labeled neatly: tonic for nerves, elixir for cough, sleeping draught. Children learned early that every discomfort had a cure. The father of the house, worn by ledgers and late nights, reached for his morphine-laced cordial before supper. The mother, frail from childbirth and grief, injected herself behind the closed door of the nursery. Even the children received their portion, a teaspoon of syrup, to calm their reffiest spirits. The home had become a small apothecary, its family bound not by affection, but by dosage. Doctors were frequent visitors, their carriages arriving with polite regularity. They examined, reassured, and prescribed. A touch of nervous agitation, they said. A simple case of fatigue. The medicine cabinet deepened with each visit, its contents multiplying like secrets. The physicians themselves could not see what they were building, a silent dependency so pervasive that it began to shape the rhythm of the household. Days revolved around doses. Sleep was scheduled like prayer. It was the wives who noticed first. They saw their husbands' tempers grow sluggish, their eyes dim with apathy. They felt their own restlessness deepen, their bodies craving more of the substance that had promised composure. But in a society that prized decorum, to confess need was to admit weakness. So they hid the vials in sewing drawers, disguised syringes in velvet cases, and called the habit restoration. When neighbors visited, they spoke of charity work and church attendance while the servants fetched the medicine tray. Servants, too, were caught in the web. They saw everything: the trembling hands, the late-night doses, the faint moans behind bedroom doors. Some stole from the bottles. Others began using the remnants to numb their own exhaustion. Addiction blurred all distinctions of class. The same morphine that soothed duchesses also softened the pain of scullery maids. The same elixir of calm dulled both the despair of poverty and the ennui of privilege. By the late 1880s, death notices had begun to change in tone. After a long illness, they read, or passed peacefully at home. But among the medical men, the truth was whispered: morphia, exhaustion, chronic poisoning, sleep that would not wake. Each household seemed to lose one member to the same gentle fate, a death without struggle, a mercy that arrived too easily. Newspapers rarely mentioned morphine by name. It was impolite to accuse the respectable dead of vice. Yet behind the scenes, coroners' reports multiplied, and pharmacists began keeping private lists of repeat customers. Society had discovered a new epidemic, one too genteel to name. The war at home did not explode, it seeped. It crept through carpets and draperies, through teacups and linen. It disguised itself as peace, as composure, as the very thing the Victorians cherished most: control. And so, the battle went unseen. No flags, no heroes, no victories, only the steady drip of the syringe, the slow fading of breath, the empire's finest families falling quietly to a war they refused to acknowledge, fought entirely within their own walls. The cafes of Bloomsbury and the drawing rooms of Chelsea began to hum with a new kind of conversation. Pain, once hidden behind curtained respectability, had become poetry. Morphine, once confined to the doctor's syringe, now found itself immortalized in sonnets, serialized novels, and the whispered verses of men who fancied themselves prophets of sensation. The empire's most celebrated minds were turning their private dependencies into public art. The romantic fascination with opium had long ago given birth to literary ghosts. Coleridge's Kubla Khan, De Quincey's Confessions, Poe's mournful dreams. But morphine was something else, cleaner, colder, clinical. It belonged to the age of science and steel. Where laudanum had inspired feverish visions of paradise, morphine inspired detachment. It was the perfect muse for a generation weary of passion. The drug has no color, no taste, wrote one young essayist. Only absence, and that in itself is sublime. In the cafes, critics debated the virtues of artificial calm. The decadents praised the drug as rebellion against the vulgar noise of progress. Morphine refines the soul, declared one, as civilization refines cruelty. They spoke of it as a new religion, one that worshipped silence instead of salvation. Pain was primitive, they said. The future belonged to those who could master it. Some poets carried small vials in their pockets, touching them like talismans as they read aloud their languid stanzas. Among them moved figures of tragedy disguised as brilliance. The playwrights who wrote of love but felt nothing. The painters who captured despair in precise brushstrokes between injections. The critics who composed essays on ecstasy with trembling hands. Their letters to one another read like confessions. I live in two worlds, now the waking one and the better one within the needle. They mistook dependence for depth. The public mistook their collapse for genius. Publishers, ever alert to fashion, began printing tales that romanticized the habit. The Lady of the White Sleep, the calm of the veins, the doctor's mercy. Even respectable magazines printed serialized stories of beautiful women wasting gracefully away under the spell of the syringe. "The morphine woman," one writer observed, "is the angel of our times, frail, luminous, untouchable." It was an image that sold books and perfumes alike. Outside those smoky rooms, the city's addicts read the same words and found validation. If poets could live on morphine and still be adored, then perhaps there was beauty in their own decline. Pharmacies near Fleet Street reported a surge in purchases after each new issue of the literary journals. One chemist remarked dryly that his best customers, quote, "more verse than prescriptions." But genius does not forgive the body. By the century's end, many of these dream merchants were dead, overdosed, exhausted, or committed to asylums that smelled of damp stone and despair. Their pens lay beside their syringes, both instruments of escape. Their readers mourned them as martyrs to art, never realizing they were simply casualties of the same empire-wide experiment in forgetting. The Victorians had once believed that industry would perfect the body and empire would perfect the world. Now their poets believed morphine would perfect the soul, but the only perfection it offered was silence, a silence so seductive that the entire age leaned toward it, listening, mistaking oblivion for beauty, and calling it inspiration. By the turn of the century, a generation had grown up beneath the shadow of the syringe. The children of morphine users, those delicate sons and daughters of England's refinement, came of age in houses that smelled faintly of medicine and linen. Their lullabies were the soft clicks of vials against porcelain trays. Their morning light filtered through curtains drawn to protect delicate nerves. They were born into a silence so complete that even laughter seemed indecent. Their parents called it composure. History would call it dependence. Many of these children had never known their mothers awake before noon. The governess handled the lessons while Madame rested upstairs, her face serene, her voice slurred with politeness when she descended for tea. Fathers worked late, returning home pale and distracted, fingers stained with ink and the faint white dust of the powder they carried from the chemist. The children learned early that certain doors in the house were never to be. Opened the study, the nursery cabinet, the locked drawer in the parlor where the medicine was kept. They were houses of ghosts, whose owners still lived within. The physicians saw the inheritance in their patients' offspring long before the public did. Infants born trembling, restless, with eyes too wide, too knowing. They called it maternal weakness, a genteel term for withdrawal in the womb. Nurses whispered that such babies seemed born tired of the world. Some did not survive their first week. Those who did grew quiet and pale, prone to fainting, afflicted with what doctors called nervous fragility. Society pitied them, praised their sensitivity, mistook sickness for sophistication. The cycle deepened as the children grew. Daughters of morphine mothers often inherited the same prescriptions. When adolescence brought anxiety or sleeplessness, the family doctor recommended the same treatment that comforted your dear mama. Sons of soldiers and scholars inherited not medals or manuscripts, but the quiet legacy of addiction bottles and syringes wrapped in velvet, tucked into drawers like heirlooms. Some refused the habit, most did not. It had become part of the family ritual, the rhythm of modern life. Even literature began to reflect this second generation of sufferers. The New Woman novels of the 1890s featured heroines who sought freedom from society's rules, only to find themselves ensnared by their own chemical escape. "I cannot tell where my will ends and the medicine begins," one fictional character wrote, echoing hundreds of real voices. Readers sympathized but did not protest. They were, after all, the same audience that sipped morphine tonics to steady their hands as they turned the pages. By the final decades of Queen Victoria's reign, the pattern had hardened into something like inheritance law. Addiction ran through families like an unspoken title, passed from mother to daughter, father to son, more faithfully than land or fortune. Doctors noted it quietly, apothecaries profited discreetly, and society looked the other way. The empire that once prided itself on moral purity had bred a new nobility of numbness. Those children, pale and proper, would grow up to run the banks, the newspapers, the ministries. Their voices, calm and reasonable, would shape the new century. Yet in their veins, something ancient still whispered the same soft hum that had followed their parents into sleep. It was not pain, nor pleasure, but the echo of both. The empire's inheritance was not gold, but forgetfulness, carried forward one injection at a time. They were the guardians of the Victorian miracle, the priests of progress who had ushered morphine into the world with steady hands and unshakable faith. But by the last quarter of the century, the physicians themselves had begun to fall to the same quiet temptation they had once prescribed so freely. The healer and the afflicted were no longer separate. The line between mercy and need had dissolved, and in the medical journals of London, the first cracks of confession began to appear. Dr. Lionel Grafton was one of them. A lecturer at King's College, known for his polished manners and clinical precision, he had been among the earliest to champion morphine's rational administration. To his students, he spoke of the drug as the cornerstone of modern humanitarian medicine. To his patients, he was a savior who replaced agony with sleep. Yet, in his own notebooks, he recorded a different gospel, one written in trembling ink. "It begins," he wrote in 1884, "with the smallest indulgence, a prick of curiosity, a taste of control. The doctor is not immune to the very relief he grants." The first dose was professional. He wished to understand the subjective effects for an upcoming lecture. The second was practical, a lingering migraine from long hours in the theatre. The third he did not explain. Within a year, he was injecting himself nightly, convinced he was maintaining discipline. His lectures became erratic. His students whispered about his sudden silences mid-sentence, his moments of angelic calm followed by days of exhaustion. By the time he resigned, no one dared speak the word aloud, though everyone knew he had joined the growing brotherhood of addicted physicians, a fraternity of silent sufferers hidden behind the facade of respectability. They were everywhere: surgeons, anesthetists, family doctors, men who could recite dosage tables from memory but no longer knew their own limits. They told themselves it was not indulgence but necessity, the price of long hours, the burden of constant pain, the fatigue of endless compassion. Morphine dulled the tremor in their hands and the dread in their hearts. It steadied them through childbirths, amputations, and deathbeds, and then it steadied them through breakfast. Hospitals began to keep quiet lists of reassigned staff doctors whose ill health had rendered them unfit for duty. Medical journals published veiled warnings. Practitioners must guard against the temptation to self-administer. Behind these polite phrases lay ruined careers, suicides disguised as strokes, families left destitute. One editor of The Lancet admitted privately, "We have created a cure for pain, but not for the conscience that follows it." Some sought treatment at private sanatoriums, where they were subjected to isolation and cold baths. Others turned to religion, preaching abstinence from the same pulpits where they once praised progress. A few wrote memoirs, half apology, half experiment, pleading for reform. None could escape the paradox. The men who had liberated humanity from agony had enslaved themselves to its antidote. By the century's final years, it was an open secret that London's finest physicians carried their salvation in their waistcoat pockets. The chemist no longer questioned the frequency of their visits. "A dose for the nerves," they would say, smiling with the same practiced calm they had once prescribed to others. The profession that had promised to heal the world was now treating its own disease in silence. The doctor's oath to do no harm had become a whisper in the mirror, and every reflection showed the same truth, that mercy, once made mechanical, eventually consumes the hand that delivers it. By the dawn of the 1890s, compassion had been legislated. The government, after decades of polite avoidance, finally turned its gaze toward the silent epidemic that had crept from hospitals to homes, from prescriptions to parlors. The Dangerous Drugs Act was still a generation away, but its shadow had already begun to lengthen. The word addict, once whispered behind clinic doors, now appeared in police ledgers, and for the first time in British history, mercy itself had become a crime. It began quietly, as all bureaucratic purges do. Magistrates in London and Edinburgh received reports from coroners: too many deaths by medicinal excess, too many empty vials found beside respectable corpses. The newspapers, always hungry for scandal, began to print stories of society ladies ruined by morphia, of clergymen caught with the syringe. What had once been hidden behind silk curtains now stood beneath the glare of moral outrage. The public demanded action, and the state obliged. Pharmacists became informants. Every sale of morphine, once a matter of discretion, was recorded in ledgers stamped with government seals. To protect the public, officials claimed, though in truth they were protecting the illusion of virtue. Doctors were instructed to report habitual users. The police were given lists of known names. Addiction was no longer an illness, it was disobedience. And yet, even as the law tightened, the demand did not diminish. It merely changed shape. Those who could no longer afford the doctor's note turned to the alleys behind Fleet Street, where street chemists sold diluted morphine mixed with gin, or powders cut with chalk and arsenic. The poor suffered openly, their decline visible and shamed. The wealthy continued in secrecy, protected by privacy and reputation. Justice, as always, favored those with drawing rooms. In courtrooms, the spectacle was tragicomic. A factory worker was sentenced to 6 months for stealing morphine from her employer's medical chest. The same week, a baronet's widow was acquitted after admitting to using it for spiritual fatigue. Judges spoke gravely about the dangers of indulgence, while physicians testified that certain temperaments were more susceptible. The meaning was clear. Poverty made you a criminal. Refinement made you a patient. In the newspapers, addiction was transformed into morality play. The Pall Mall Gazette called it the white plague of the soul, urging repentance, not reform. The Times lamented a generation seeking solace in syringes instead of scripture. Editorials called for moral hygiene, a phrase that sounded like cleanliness, but meant control. The same society that had prescribed morphine as progress now denounced its users as degenerates. For the afflicted, there was no refuge. Doctors refused treatment for fear of scandal. Families hid their addicts in asylums, where the cure was starvation and abstinence. Many never emerged. In these bleak institutions, the empire's compassion finally revealed its cruelty. They sought to punish what they had once encouraged. By the century's close, the morphine user had become a symbol of fallen modernity, the consequence of too much comfort, too little restraint. But the truth was simpler and far more damning. England had built an empire on control of bodies, of labor, of nations. Morphine was only another form of it, a chemical leash that had slipped from the hand of its master. The laws could arrest the addicts, but not the hunger. The courts could confiscate the syringes, but not the memory of relief. Beneath the gaslight, men and women still gathered in shadows, whispering the old prayer of progress. Just one more drop. They were the criminals of comfort, punished for believing what the empire had once promised them, that pain, like poverty, could be conquered. She was never named in the hospital records, only referred to as the night nurse. Her handwriting, however, survives, delicate, slanted, precise. In the margins of patient ledgers from a London infirmary dated 1893, there appear faint notations that do not belong to any official report. Patient trembling, asked for peace again, whispered that the drug feels like forgiveness. Doctor says relief is kindness, but whose? Her name, uncovered years later through payroll books, was Clara Hensley. She was 32 when she began working the night shift at St. Luke's Hospital, a charity institution built on both piety and poverty. The wards were crowded, the ceilings low, the smell of disinfectant barely disguising the odors of sweat and sickness. By day, Visiting philanthropists toured the halls and congratulated the doctors on the serenity of their patients. By night, Clara saw the price of that serenity: the soft blue marks on arms, labored breaths of those mercifully sedated, the strange, glacial calm that spread through a man's face after the syringe left his skin. Clara had been taught that pain was to be endured, that God rewarded patience. Her faith, like her uniform, was spotless when she began. But working beneath the gaslights changed her. The doctors spoke of morphine as science's greatest victory. Clara saw it as something else entirely: a quiet devouring. Every evening, she made her rounds with the tray of ampules and needles, the instruments gleaming like small instruments of confession. "Be still," she would whisper, and they would obey. She began to hate the obedience most of all. In her private notebook, the one she kept hidden beneath her mattress, Clara wrote down what the ledgers would never record. They stop crying after the second dose, not because the pain is gone, but because they no longer care. Another entry reads, "The doctors sleep soundly. The patients sleep forever." And then, one night, she wrote only 4 words. "I tried it myself." It was not curiosity that drove her, but exhaustion from the endless nights, the hollow prayers, the knowledge that she was both witness and accomplice. The needle slid easily under her skin. The warmth spread like a secret she could finally understand. For the first time in years, she did not hear the moans from the ward or the ticking of the clock. She felt nothing, and it terrified her. She never did it again, though the temptation never left her. When the hospital superintendent discovered her notes after her death in 1897, he called them hysterical ramblings and ordered them burned. A sympathetic orderly saved them instead, smuggling the pages into the archives. Decades later, historians would find her words and call them the first honest account of institutional addiction in Victorian medicine, the record of a nurse who saw mercy as a mask for complicity. In the end, Clara died not from morphine, but from pneumonia, the kind that spreads through cold wards and colder consciences. Her last entry, written in a trembling hand, read simply, "The Lord giveth, the doctor taketh away," and both call it mercy. No memorial marks her grave. Only her words remain a whisper beneath the gaslight, echoing for all the voices that never could. By the late 1890s, the newspapers had found a new obsession: women who killed, not with arsenic in teacups or daggers in the dark, but with the quiet precision of a syringe. They called them the morphine murderesses, and their trials filled the morning headlines with the perfect mixture of horror and fascination. For the first time, addiction and crime were intertwined in the public imagination, bound together by a single, elegant needle. The cases began modestly, whispered first in hospitals and then in the courts. A nurse in Manchester who accidentally over-administered morphine to an elderly patient. A midwife in Bristol who was found with a black bag containing empty ampoules and a forged prescription pad. The newspapers, hungry for scandal, began to romanticize them. The angels of death, the Pall Mall Gazette declared. Women who mistake mercy for murder. But the most infamous of all was Margaret Tolland of Kensington, a widow, 40 years old, pale as her name suggested. In 1896, she was arrested after the death of her employer, an aging barrister who had relied on her companionship and her care. The man had been found lying peacefully in his chair, a copy of the Times folded neatly on his lap. At first, it seemed a natural passing. Only when his solicitor examined the estate did the pattern emerge: a will rewritten in Margaret's favour, and an apothecary's ledger showing an unusual amount of morphine purchased in her name. At her trial, she appeared composed, almost saintly. The papers described her as a woman of calm intelligence and touching frailty. When the prosecutor accused her of poisoning her benefactor for money, she replied softly, "He begged me to stop the pain." And when the judge asked whether she knew the dose was lethal, she answered, "I only wished him peace." The courtroom fell silent. The jury, transfixed by her serenity, debated for 6 hours before delivering their verdict: guilty, but recommended to mercy. She was sentenced to death, later commuted to life in prison. Reporters called her the embodiment of modern compassion turned monstrous. Others simply called her a victim of the very drug she had used to kill. She had been taking morphine herself for years, prescribed after the death of her husband. Friends said it had quieted her nature. The truth, as one prison doctor later wrote, was simpler. Her empathy had been dissolved grain by grain until she mistook stillness for kindness. The Tolland case ignited moral panic. Every nurse became suspect, every bottle of morphine a potential weapon. Hospitals tightened their stores, new laws demanded written prescriptions, and the era of unregulated mercy began to close. Yet the fascination endured. The public devoured each new trial. Unable to look away from the contradiction these women embodied, the merging of care and cruelty, of healing and harm. In truth, they were not devils, but reflections. The morphine murderesses were the logical conclusion of a century that had confused relief with righteousness. They had merely carried the Victorian creed of mercy to its final, fatal perfection, and as their names faded from the headlines, the public returned to their own bottles, their own doses, their own quiet dependencies, reassured that the real danger lay not in themselves, but in those few unfortunate women who had made compassion too complete. At the edge of London, beyond the fog and soot of the city's heart, stood a new kind of asylum, the Morphia Clinic. Its purpose, declared in bold print on brass plaques, was reform through abstinence. Yet within its high brick walls, mercy ended at the threshold. The patients who entered came willingly at first, trembling and ashamed, convinced they were seeking salvation. They were greeted not by doctors but by warders, and stripped of everything that could bring comfort: jewelry, letters, syringes, even hope. The cure, it was said, began with suffering. These institutions rose in the final decade of the century, after the trials of the morphine murderesses had scandalized the public and frightened the government into action. Charitable committees, chaired by clergymen and aristocrats, raised money to redeem the fallen. What they built were prisons masquerading as hospitals. Some were converted workhouses, others abandoned country estates. All were the same in spirit: long corridors of polished despair, gas lamps flickering over iron bedsteads where patients tossed through endless nights of withdrawal. The regimen was simple, brutal, and precise. No morphine was permitted, not even in trace amounts. Food was sparse, the air thick with disinfectant and fear. Patients were made to bathe in cold water at dawn to shock the system toward purity. At noon, they marched in silence through the gardens for moral exercise. At night, the attendants read scripture aloud until the lights were extinguished. The screams were not recorded in the ledgers, but the nurses heard them through the walls. One such patient, a woman named Alice Fairley, left behind a journal smuggled out by a sympathetic attendant. Her words, written in trembling pencil, described the transformation from faith to despair. "The cure," she wrote, "is worse than the disease. I am punished for the mercy that made me sick. They call me saved when I no longer feel anything at all." She was discharged 3 months later, greatly improved. 2 weeks afterward, she was found dead in her lodgings, a syringe still in her hand. The coroner's report called it relapse. Her diary called it reunion. For the administrators, these deaths were proof of necessity. "The moral weak will always fail," wrote one reformer in 1898. "But we must attempt to save the few whose wills remain intact." The irony was lost on him that willpower had nothing to do with the chemical tyranny they called temptation. The clinics multiplied nonetheless, spreading from London to Glasgow, from Manchester to Dublin. Some were private and discreet, others public and punitive. Each called itself progress. The newspapers praised them. The Times ran editorials lauding the first organized effort to reclaim victims of indulgence. Photographs showed tidy beds, bright gardens, smiling matrons. No one printed the accounts of the patients themselves, the letters begging to be released, the trembling signatures on suicide notes. The Clinic of Shadows, as the nurses bitterly called it, became a monument to the Empire's favorite illusion, that pain could be cured through punishment, and that mercy could be restored by taking it away. By the century's end, the morphine epidemic had been contained, but not ended. The clinics had broken bodies, not habits. The city outside remained dependent, only quieter, its sickness driven indoors, into privacy and shame. And within those walls, where suffering was mistaken for sanctity, the patients learned what their doctors never could, that the worst prison is not the one built by others, but the one erected within the self, brick by brick, dose by dose, until all that remains is silence. When the 19th century began to dim, the British Empire stood at its zenith, vast, glittering, seemingly invincible. Maps painted half the world in red, the seas carried its banners, and London boasted that the sun would never set upon its dominion. Yet beneath this golden surface, a quieter empire was dissolving, one built not on trade or conquest, but on chemistry. For while Britain's fleets commanded the oceans, its own veins had surrendered to a subtler invasion, the drug that had once made it strong. In the colonies, the problem was no longer whispered but written in ledgers and medical reports. British officers in India reported troops sluggish and unreliable, their discipline softened by the daily doses of morphine meant to treat fever and homesickness. In Calcutta and Rangoon, military surgeons noted that men long accustomed to injections cannot march without them. Opium had enslaved Asia. Morphine, its refined descendant, was now enslaving those who had brought it there. The hypocrisy was monumental. A generation earlier, Britain had waged the opium wars against China in defense of free trade, forcing a foreign nation to consume the very substance that now rotted its own cities from within. London merchants still grew rich from the poppy fields of Bengal, even as their sons returned from school pale and hollow-eyed, addicted to its purified form. The empire was exporting decay while importing dependence. It was, in its way, the most British trade imaginable. Moral indignation shipped out, moral ruin brought home. Reports trickled in from Africa, Australia, and the Caribbean, missionaries and colonial officers describing natives accustomed to the needle, plantation workers too weak to labor without their evening draft, native nurses administering morphine in the name of civilization. The empire had not only conquered lands, it had shared its afflictions. "We bring progress," one missionary wrote proudly, "and with it, the comforts of the modern world." He did not see the irony when his own wife died of accidental overdose 2 years later. Back in London, Parliament debated the issue with the same polite detachment it reserved for distant famines. Some called for moral reform, others for tighter laws. But few dared to admit the truth that the British Empire's great engine of progress ran on pain, and morphine had simply become its oil. Soldiers used it to march farther, workers to labor longer, mothers to endure the grief that empire's expansion demanded. It was both the empire's lubricant and its disease. By the turn of the century, the foreign press had begun to notice. French and German papers mocked the British plague of comfort, calling it the decline of a stoic race. America, soon to inherit Britain's mantle of empire, took note as well, studying the mistakes of the mother country while quietly replicating them. Yet in Whitehall and Westminster, the official story never changed. Britain remained, outwardly, a paragon of strength, a nation of reason, restraint, and Christian virtue. But in the parlours of London, in the barracks of Bombay, and in the hospitals of the colonies, the same quiet truth persisted. The empire's veins were full, and its heart was tired. When Queen Victoria died in 1901, the mourners said her passing marked the end of an age. They were not wrong. The long reign that had conquered the globe had also conquered pain, and in doing so, it had learned to mistake numbness for greatness. The empire that had once prided itself on endurance could no longer bear to feel. Its weakness was not in its enemies abroad, but in its silence, at home, a silence bought, drop by drop, with morphine. By the first years of the new century, the business of mercy had become an industry. The age of the lone apothecary with dusty jars and moral hesitations was over. In his place rose the medicine man, not the tribal healer of foreign lands mocked by imperial arrogance, but the suited chemist of London, Berlin, and New York, who spoke of modern progress and thought in profit margins. Factories that had once milled flour or ink now churned out morphine by the ton, packed neatly in glass vials stamped with emblems of respectability. Merck, Bayer, Burroughs, Wellcome & Co. The empire of drugs had found its merchants. Advertisements began to shift tone. Gone were the florid claims of miracle elixirs and secret tonics. In their place appeared sleek announcements couched in scientific authority. Purity, guaranteed, they promised. Standardized for dosage and safety. The phrasing soothed the public's conscience, the language of laboratories replacing that of vice. Bottles came labeled with precise milligrams, each bearing the assurance that what you were buying was not indulgence, but medicine, not weakness, but science. Morphia, as they still called it, had been domesticated at last, stripped of its scandal, packaged in progress. The men behind this transformation were not doctors, though they borrowed the white coat's credibility. They were industrialists with laboratories for cathedrals and catalogues for scriptures. One could send away by post for morphine kits, complete with syringe, ampules, and instructions written in the language of hygiene. They sold to hospitals and housewives alike, their prices scaled to every class. "Our duty," declared a Bayer pamphlet in 1904, "is to bring relief to all mankind." It did not mention profit, though profit was its only faith. In Britain, the tone of medicine changed as well. Medical journals filled with articles about ethical distribution and rational administration. Careful euphemisms that disguised dependence behind policy. Doctors had become intermediaries between the suffering and the suppliers, their reputations tied to the flow of product. They attended conferences funded by pharmaceutical firms, where lectures extolled the virtues of scientific comfort. Morphine had ceased to be a scandal, it was now a commodity. And commodities, unlike sins, required no forgiveness. In rural towns, the new medicine men traveled with crates of samples, offering doctors generous incentives to prescribe their brands. Chemists' windows gleamed with imported powders and tablets, each claiming to be less habit-forming than the rest. The word habit, once shameful, had been redefined. A useful habit, one trade magazine said approvingly, is simply the continued use of a reliable remedy. But even as the industry polished its image, the undercurrent of unease remained. Death certificates multiplied, overdoses climbed. The purity the companies promised made the drug more potent, not safer. The very precision that modern science celebrated ensured that addiction became not an accident, but an inevitability. In the colonies, these same medicine men sold morphine with missionary zeal, promising to uplift the native constitution. Their glass bottles traveled alongside Bibles, rifles, and railway steel, the tools of empire repackaged as progress. The irony was exquisite. The British now spread their own corruption under the banner of civilization, certain that control could sanctify anything. By 1910, morphine addiction had become too profitable to cure. The industry that once claimed to eradicate pain now depended upon it. The factories kept their chimneys burning, the advertisements kept their promises, and the doctors kept their pens busy. The age of mercy had given birth to the age of marketing, a transformation as complete as any alchemy. And in the bright laboratories of the medicine men, where pain was measured in profit and salvation came sealed in glass, the empire's conscience was refined one grain at a time, until only the sheen of progress remained. By the middle of the first decade of the 20th century, the mood of Britain had changed. The empire that had once whispered about morphine behind velvet curtains was now shouting about it from pulpits and newspapers. The same society that had sold the drug as refinement now condemned it as rot. Compassion had given way to panic. What had been a matter of health became a question of morality, and the line between the two blurred beneath the flicker of the gaslight. It began with a series of deaths, quiet, almost routine, until someone began connecting the names. A celebrated actress found cold in her chambers, a barrister's son dead in a Soho boarding house, a bishop's wife discovered asleep forever in her drawing room. Their deaths were polite, bloodless, scandalous, only in pattern. The papers seized on the symmetry, printing headlines that turned tragedy into sermon. The curse of morphia, claims another. Beneath the headlines, columnists spoke of decadence, of moral collapse, of a nation growing soft under the weight of its own comforts. Parliament took notice. Committees were formed. Inquiries launched. Doctors were summoned to testify about the extent of habitual indulgence. The witnesses spoke in evasions, excess, injudicious use, unfortunate consequences. No one dared to say addiction outright, but in the silence between their words, the panic swelled. Moralists warned that the empire itself was at risk, that the vigor of its people, the purity of its women, the bravery of its soldiers were being dissolved in a tide of narcotic weakness. The churches joined the chorus. Sermons thundered that morphine was Satan's anesthesia, the devil's way of lulling souls into sin. Clergymen preached temperance, not only in drink, but in medicine. In temperance halls across the country, pamphlets were distributed with titles like The White Poison and The New Slavery. They showed drawings of angelic women transformed into gaunt phantoms, of doctors with serpent eyes offering syringes instead of salvation. The imagery was lurid and effective. Fear became the empire's newest cure. For the addicts themselves, the panic brought no relief, only humiliation. The once patient was now the sinner, the once treated, the condemned. Hospitals refused admission to those labeled habitual. Pharmacies demanded documentation. Families hid their afflicted behind locked doors or sent them to asylums under false names. The medical establishment, eager to cleanse its reputation, denied responsibility. The drug that had been medicine yesterday was poison today, and those who needed it most were cast adrift. Newspapers told stories of redemption, fallen women restored by faith, former addicts reborn through cold abstinence and prayer. Few of these tales were true. Most of the redeemed were simply gone, their deaths unrecorded, their silence interpreted as success. Yet the panic did accomplish one thing. It ended the age of innocence. The public could no longer pretend that morphine was harmless, nor that its spread was accidental, but rather than face its complicity, the nation turned to the comfort of blame. The problem was not the doctors, nor the factories, nor the moral vacuum at the heart of empire. It was the weak, the feminine, the foreign, the poor. They became the scapegoats of the empire's conscience. And so the cycle continued. Mercy turned to punishment, sympathy to fear. The same syringe that had once symbolized progress now embodied sin. The moral panic was not a reckoning, it was a disguise. Beneath its noise, nothing truly changed. The empire still wanted silence, and morphine, in its perverse way, continued to provide it. It began with a story whispered between nurses at Guy's hospital, the kind that traveled through the wards like rumor, gaining weight as it went. A young soldier, barely 23, had been admitted for a minor injury, a fractured arm sustained in training. He was healthy, strong, and due for discharge within a fortnight. His name was William Carter, though the staff referred to him simply as the patient in bed 14. On his second night, writhing with pain, a physician administered what had become the standard prescription for suffering, a small injection of morphine. The dose was modest, ordinary, the kind given 1,000 times before. Carter slept through the night. The nurse on duty remarked that he smiled faintly in his dreams, but in the morning, when she came to wake him, His eyes remained closed. His chest rose and fell with shallow rhythm. His lips murmured fragments of words that made no sense. He was alive, and yet not. Days passed, then weeks. His wound healed, but Carter did not. His body remained strong, his pulse steady, his mind unreachable. The doctors called it post-anesthetic catalepsy, then delirium prolongé, then, finally, nothing at all. They took notes, sketched diagrams, debated theories of the nervous system. None admitted the simplest possibility that the very substance meant to bring rest had stolen him from waking life entirely. Outside the ward, London moved on as it always did, the click of carriages, the toll of church bells, the murmur of progress. But within those hospital walls, Bed 14 became a shrine to the Empire's paradox. Visitors came, students, journalists, even clergymen, each gazing upon the young man who lay suspended between life and death, the body of proof that mercy could go too far. The Illustrated London News ran a quiet column titled "The Morphine Sleep," describing Carter as the unfortunate soldier who rests beyond reach of both pain and prayer. His mother came from Devon to see him, travelling 3 days by train and coach. She brought a sprig of lavender and a small Bible, which she placed beside his bed. When she touched his face, she whispered, "Will, can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered once, then stilled. She asked the doctor if he was in pain. The doctor replied, with professional calm, "Madam, he feels nothing." She began to weep, though she did not know whether for relief or horror. After 6 months, they moved him to a quieter room, one used for chronic cases. A priest came daily, sitting by the bed and reading aloud from the Psalms. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures," he intoned, though even he could not ignore the grim echo of the words. Eventually, the priests stopped coming. The nurses tended to Carter as they would a relic, washing his body, trimming his hair, keeping the linen spotless. They began to speak of him in the past tense, though his heart continued to beat. When he finally died, after 11 months of sleep, his death certificate recorded the cause simply as cardiac failure. The hospital report listed no mention of morphine. It was, after all, medicine too noble, too modern to be accused of murder. But among the nurses, a superstition was born. They said that sometimes, in the quiet hour before dawn, a scent of lavender would drift through the ward, and the sound of slow, rhythmic breathing could be heard from the empty bed where William Carter once lay. They would whisper, "He has not woken yet." The story spread because it was true in a way no document could capture. Carter's endless sleep was the Empire's own reflection, its body alive, its spirit anesthetized, dreaming of glory while the world around it began to stir. By the time the new century settled over London like a grey shawl, the doctors had begun to admit, at least privately, that they had no idea how to cure the thing they had created. Addiction had no language in their textbooks, no chapter in their lectures, no code in their ledgers. It was not a disease. They insisted diseases had causes. It was not sin. Either sins had redemption. What, then, was it? A habit? A flaw of temperament? A rebellion of the body against progress itself? The doctors argued in conferences and columns, while their patients wasted quietly in the beds they prescribed. Each new year brought another treatment, advertised as the breakthrough. There was the gold cure, promising miraculous recovery through injections of chloride and willpower. There was the Keeley method, imported from America, which used electric shocks to drive out desire. There were tonics brewed from strychnine, baths of ice, months of starvation, and always there were prayers, whispered by nurses who still believed salvation was a matter of endurance. In sanatoriums across Britain, addicts were locked away for months at a time, stripped of their medicine, fed on broth and sermons. The walls of these institutions echoed with pleading and vomiting, and the sound of fingernails scratching at iron bed frames. Doctors called it progress. Patients called it hell. One of them, a former governess named Edith Dane, wrote secretly during her treatment at a private asylum in Surrey. Her notes, later found hidden beneath the floorboards, are the truest record of that particular purgatory. "I wake trembling," she wrote. "They tell me the shaking will pass once I am purified. I do not feel purified. I feel erased." After 3 weeks, she began to hallucinate voices calling from the corridor, not spirits, but the cries of other patients in withdrawal. "They sound like prayers," she noted, "but no one answers." When she finally escaped barefoot, delirious, and half-starved, the newspapers called her recovery a miracle. She died the following winter. The asylums kept their success stories, printing them as pamphlets for donors. The failures were buried quickly and quietly. Every time one of these cures collapsed under its own cruelty, another rose to take its place. Morphine was replaced by laudanum, then by cocaine, then by newly synthesized, non-addictive opiates that made the same promises in different bottles. Science could not admit defeat. Progress could not confess error. Each generation repackaged the same despair with new names and shinier labels. In 1906, a parliamentary committee reviewed the state of habitual drug users and concluded that the problem lies chiefly in moral constitution. They recommended education, supervision, and, when necessary, confinement. The phrase, "cure that never cured," began circulating among the nurses, bitter shorthand for the endless loop of compassion and cruelty that defined their work. The public, eager to believe in redemption, embraced these so-called cures. Hospitals held demonstrations for journalists showing smiling patients restored to health. Photographs were staged in bright daylight, their subjects' frailty disguised beneath fresh linens. Behind the camera, other patients screamed in padded rooms. The image of healing was enough. And so the century turned. Morphine remained, the old serpent wearing new skin, its poison hidden in the language of benevolence. No treatment could cure it, because no one wanted to cure what they could not afford, to lose the illusion that pain could be conquered without consequence. The doctors published another round of essays, congratulating themselves on the dawn of a more humane medicine. Outside their wards, the graves grew more crowded, filled with those who had been purified to death. The cure had never been a cure. It was a continuation of faith without understanding, of science without conscience, of mercy without memory. And the empire, ever proud of its innovations, kept turning the key on its own creation, confident that if it renamed the illness often enough, it would eventually forget that it was still sick. The final years of the morphine century unfolded not with revolution but with resignation. The empire had grown weary of its own indulgence. Factories still hummed, chemists still sold, doctors still prescribed, but the tone had changed. The confidence that once surrounded the white powder had faded into embarrassment. Morphine had become the ghost of progress, tolerated but never named aloud. It remained in the hospitals, in the pockets of veterans, in the secret drawers of widows, but it no longer glittered with promise. It lingered only as habit, the last echo of mercy in a world that had grown suspicious of kindness. In 1912, a physician named Dr. Lionel Grafton, the same man who once lectured about morphine's divinity and later succumbed to it himself, burned his last vial in his fireplace. He had spent 2 decades dosing patients and himself, a career built on the rhythm of the syringe. By then, he was a frail man with ink-stained fingers and eyes like cloudy glass. His study smelled of disinfectant and regret. The flame in the grate flickered pale blue as the morphine boiled inside the glass. When it shattered, he flinched, as though struck. The next morning, he recorded in his journal, "I have destroyed the last of it. My hands still tremble for want of it. It feels like burying a friend I murdered." He was not alone in his symbolic renunciation. Across Britain, doctors began quietly discarding their supplies. Some turned to new drugs, heroin, ironically marketed as a non-addictive alternative. Others, too ashamed to trust chemistry again, returned to old forms of pain management: ether, alcohol, prayer. Hospitals reclassified morphine as a restricted substance. It was not banned, merely hidden, the way one hides a family secret everyone already knows. For the patients, nothing truly changed. The prescriptions became rarer, the quantities smaller, the shame heavier. They learned to ration their doses, to feign recovery for the sake of approval. The fewer injections, the greater the virtue, their doctors told them. And so, in rooms that smelled of carbolic and dust, the faithful tried to prove their worthiness through abstinence. Some succeeded in living longer, few succeeded in living better. In rural clinics, old nurses who had once given morphine freely now refused it even to the dying. "They must meet the Lord awake," one said, her voice trembling with the conviction of cruelty mistaken for duty. Death, once softened by chemistry, became raw again. Families gathered around beds to hear the moans that medicine had long suppressed. It was, they told themselves, honest. When Dr. Grafton finally died in 1914, the war had just begun. His obituary in the Times praised him as a pioneer of humane medicine. It did not mention that his journals, discovered later by his daughter, told a different story. There is no humane medicine. There is only the mercy we can bear and the mercy we can't. The same week his obituary ran, hospital ships sailed to France, stocked with crates of morphine. The soldiers who received it called it the soldier's sleep, unaware they were inheriting the ghost of an empire that had never learned to wake. And so, the cycle renewed itself, one war following another, one dose following the last. The doctors who had sworn to end the age of morphine instead prepared it for export, carrying with them the final lesson of the Victorian century, that comfort, once discovered, can never truly be destroyed, only renamed, rebranded, and passed to the next generation like a blessed curse. It was said that one could hear the silence before dawn in the hospitals, a peculiar quiet, neither peaceful nor kind, the hush of a world drained of its own voice. That silence was the sound of withdrawal, though few recognized it as such. Across England, from the wards of London to the sanatoriums of Bath and Edinburgh, morphine was finally being taken away. Not cured, not replaced, merely removed. The empire that had built an industry upon anesthesia was now determined to wake itself, and found, to its horror, that it had forgotten how. Patients who had once been treated with reverence were now restrained. Those who had been called sufferers were labeled hysterics. The moral tide had turned so completely that compassion itself was suspect. "The age of indulgence is over," proclaimed the Lancet in 1908, "and Britain must relearn the virtue of fortitude." The statement read like a sermon, but its practice resembled punishment. In asylums and private clinics, morphine was denied to all but the most terminally ill. The withdrawals that followed were violent and prolonged. Patients shook uncontrollably, their bodies drenched in sweat, their minds swinging between despair and delirium. They begged for the drug that had once been their only mercy. Some prayed for death, others achieved it. Nurses described it as like watching the body burn itself from within. Doctors recorded their observations dispassionately. Restless, perspiring, refuses food, demands relief. Relief withheld. Among these patients was Reverend Thomas Ainsworth, a clergyman once celebrated for his sermons on temperance. He had begun using morphine for gout and had continued long after the pain was gone. When his congregation discovered his dependence, he resigned his pulpit and checked himself into a private asylum outside Reading. There, stripped of his collar and his medicine, he filled the margins of his Bible with desperate notes. "The body is a church without a roof," he wrote. "All prayers escape." He died 3 weeks later, his heart giving out mid-withdrawal. The newspapers reported his death as divine punishment. His parishioners called it proof that sin could not hide behind science. The survivors of these clinics emerged half alive. Many never recovered fully, their hands trembled, Their sleep never returned, their minds flickered with unending restlessness. They were the first ghosts of modern medicine, the cured who were not cured. Some became evangelists for abstinence, preaching against the poison that had once seduced them. Others drifted into poverty, unemployable, quietly dying in charity wards where morphine was banned even for the dying. Meanwhile, the medical establishment congratulated itself on progress. Addiction is waning, claimed the British Medical Journal in 1911, ignoring the obvious that silence was not health and absence was not recovery. The empire mistook emptiness for purity. In households once ruled by quiet elegance, the pattern repeated. Mothers who had dosed themselves nightly now shivered under blankets, their husbands locking away their medicine chests. The children grew up watching their parents shake and mutter through nights of withdrawal, learning that salvation came not from mercy, but from denial. The morphine age had not ended. It had merely changed its name. For the first time in a century, England's nights grew noisy again, not with the cries of childbirth or the clatter of industry, but with the sounds of the body remembering pain. It was the price of awakening, though few believed it worth paying. The doctors called it rehabilitation. The nurses called it cruelty. History would call it irony. The empire that had taught the world to forget now found itself wide awake, trembling, and terrified of what it remembered. The war came, and with it, the familiar music of industry and pain. Trains thundered across the countryside, carrying the wounded to hospitals that smelled of iodine and smoke. Field surgeons worked in rhythm to the guns, their sleeves soaked with blood, their hands trembling with exhaustion. And everywhere, beneath the din of chaos, the hiss of morphine, ampules cracked open by the thousands, syringes plunged into arms, the same mercy reborn under a new flag. What had once been scandal in the parlours of London was now necessity in the trenches of France. The empire had rediscovered its old salvation not for comfort this time, but for endurance. Morphine followed the soldiers like a shadow. Each regiment carried its own supply, neatly catalogued and stamped with the royal seal. Doctors spoke of it not as indulgence but efficiency. Pain weakens morale, one officer declared, and morphine strengthens resolve. It became the unseen weapon of the Great War, cleaner than whey, gas, cheaper than courage. In the flicker of lanterns across the battlefields, men drifted into the same artificial peace that had lulled their fathers decades before. When they returned home, those who returned at all the hospitals were once again filled with the half-living. Limbs amputated, nerves shattered, dreams drenched in blood and anesthesia. The physicians prescribed what they knew. The same white crystals dissolved in water, the same steady hand, the same sleep. They called it recovery, but Britain's victory was laced with morphine, and its empire, though triumphant, began to move like a sleepwalker, eyes open, heart numb. The newspapers praised the heroic modern medicine that had spared soldiers unbearable suffering. They printed photographs of clean wards and smiling nurses, and beneath them, captions that read, "Mercy at the front." No one mentioned the veterans found collapsed in lodging houses months later, their veins scarred, their eyes vacant. The war had ended, but peace had not returned. Morphine had won its final campaign. In the years that followed, the addiction spread again through the quiet streets of England, not as scandal, not as secret, but as legacy. Veterans queued at chemists for nerve tonics. Widows took injections for grief. Doctors, too weary to question, continued to prescribe. The language had changed, but the ritual remained the same. The empire congratulated itself on progress while repeating its oldest mistake, confusing silence for healing. By the 1920s, a new generation had begun to speak of empire in the past tense. Colonies demanded independence, factories slowed, the world modernized. Yet beneath the rhetoric of decline, the real end had already begun long before. The empire's decay was not written in politics or maps, but in its bloodstream, the slow surrender of will to the comfort of forgetting. The same comfort that had soothed its soldiers, its mothers, its rulers. Historians would later call it fatigue, a natural waning of imperial spirit. But those who lived through it knew better. The empire was not tired, it was sedated. It had been drifting toward sleep for half a century, lulled by the promise that pain could be conquered without consequence. Its monuments gleamed, its parades marched on, but its heart had long since been stilled by its own medicine. And so, as dusk settled over the British century, the empire lay upon its own hospital bed, strong in form, hollow in spirit. The lamps burned low, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and dust, and the world moved softly around it. Somewhere, in the stillness, a syringe clicked empty. The empire sighed, and, for the first time, truly, it slept. Time has a talent for forgiveness, or at least for forgetting. By the middle of the 20th century, the story of morphine's empire had been tidied, catalogued, and placed safely behind glass. The hospitals that once echoed with the sound of gas lamps and whispered prayers had been rebuilt in steel and concrete. The asylums were shuttered, their ledgers sealed in archives. The chemists who had trafficked mercy like merchants of grace were replaced by multinational pharmaceutical companies with slogans about health and hope. The white powder, stripped of its scandal, had simply changed its name. Progress, as ever, survived its own conscience. In the British Museum of Medicine, there is a small display tucked between the exhibits on anesthesia and surgery. Behind the glass sits a velvet-lined case containing a polished syringe, a silver spoon, and a vial labeled Morphia, ca. 1890. The caption reads, "Used in early pain management, instrument of medical innovation." Visitors pass it without pause, their eyes drawn instead to the grander relics, the iron lung, the early X-ray machine, the surgeon's bone saw. Few stop to notice how ordinary the needle looks, how deceptively clean. Children press their fingers against the glass, unaware that the entire empire once pulsed through that gleaming point. The records surrounding the artifact are sparse. No one knows who used it, or how many hands passed it down: doctor, nurse, addict, mother, soldier. Perhaps it belonged to Dr. Grafton, who burned his last vial before the Great War. Perhaps to Clara Hensley, the nurse who wrote that the drug felt like forgiveness in liquid form. Or perhaps it was just one of thousands, indistinguishable in its perfection. It hardly matters. The power of the relic lies not in ownership, but in its stillness. Scholars come to study it sometimes, their notes filled with phrases like the paradox of mercy and control, or the anesthetic of empire. They write about the intersection of science and morality, about the way Britain's faith in progress became its undoing. Yet even their language feels distant, academic, sanitized, another form of anesthesia. For what words could truly capture what that needle held? A century's worth of pain and relief, of births eased and wars prolonged, of lives saved and souls undone. At closing time, when the last visitors leave and the lights dim, the hall falls quiet. The hum of modern machines fades, replaced by a silence that seems to throb faintly, as if the glass itself remembers. Outside, London moves on, buses roaring, crowds laughing, neon flashing through the drizzle. But within that small case, time holds its breath. The syringe lies still, the last witness of an age that mistook numbness for progress, mercy for mastery. Some nights, the security guards swear they see condensation form on the glass, a single drop, clear as a tear, sliding down to vanish at the rim. They joke about ghosts, but they never touch the display. Perhaps they sense, in some dim corner of instinct, that the story behind that needle is not finished. For though the empire has fallen and the doctors have turned to new miracles, the hunger it awakened endures. Every new drug, every new promise of painless perfection, carries its reflection, that faint shimmer beneath the glass. The empire's monuments may crumble, but its anesthetic dream persists, whispering softly from within the museum walls. We can make it stop. We can make it quiet. Just one more drop.